Clara Whitmore hit the saloon floor before she ever saw the boot that put her there. Her palms slapped the boards. Her satchel skidded, and 30 men watched a widow fall and said nothing. She pushed herself up on shaking arms, spat blood, and lifted her chin at the man wearing a sheriff's badge. "I came for my husband's ledger," she said, "not for your mercy." Somewhere behind her a chair scraped back, a slow, deliberate sound, and every man in that room went still. If you love stories where a broken woman becomes unbreakable, subscribe now and follow this story all the way to the end, and comment the name of the town you're watching from, so I can see how far Clara's story has traveled. The doors of the Rusted Spur banged shut behind Clara Whitmore, and every conversation in the room died a little. She stood just inside the threshold, one hand pressed to the worn leather satchel at her hip, and let them look. 30 men, maybe more. Cattlemen with dust in the creases of their necks. Card players with their hands frozen over their chips. A piano that stopped mid-note when the fellow at the keys twisted around to see what the wind had blown in. A woman, alone, in a black travel dress gone gray at the hem. "I'm looking for Sheriff Silas Crow," Clara said. Her voice did not shake. She had spent the whole ride from the stage depot making sure it would not shake. Nobody answered her. A man near the bar spat into a brass cuspidor and looked away. "I said I'm looking for the sheriff." Louder now. "Somebody in this room knows where he sits." A chair creaked. At the long table by the far wall beneath a lamp that swung on its chain, a man leaned back and folded his hands across his vest. He was not a large man, but he filled the space the way a snake fills a burrow, like everything around him had learned to bend. "You found him, ma'am." Silas Crow smiled, and it was a good smile, an easy smile, the kind that had won him this town, one handshake at a time. "Though I confess I don't recall inviting a lady into a place like this. I didn't come for an invitation." "No." He tipped his head. "I don't reckon you did." Clara crossed the floor. Every board announced her. She was aware of the men parting around her, of the smell of tobacco and spilled beer and horse, of the way the light hit the star pinned to Crow's chest and made it wink at her like a private joke. She stopped 6 feet from his table and set her satchel down on the empty chair across from him, slow, deliberate, so he could see she meant to stay. "My name is Clara Whitmore." Something flickered behind the sheriff's eyes. Just a flicker. But she had ridden 3 days and 2 nights waiting to see it, and she caught it, and she held on to it like a coin in her fist. "My husband was Daniel Whitmore. He surveyed the ridge north of here 2 years back. He registered a silver claim at your land office, legal and proper, filed and stamped." She kept her chin level. "Then he died, and the claim disappeared out of the book like it had never been written. I've come for what's mine. I've come for his survey ledger." The saloon had gone so quiet, she could hear the lamp chain ticking. Crow leaned forward. He laced his fingers together on the table and looked at her the way a man looks at a horse. He's deciding whether to buy or shoot. "Mrs. Whitmore." He said the name gently, almost kindly. "I'm terrible sorry for your loss. Truly. Fever took your husband, if I recollect. Bad way to go." He paused. "But there ain't no ledger. There ain't no claim. There's a grieving widow who's ridden a long way on a story somebody sold her, and I'd hate to see her ride back on that same story with nothing in her hands." "There's a claim?" Clara said. "I have the receipt for the filing fee, Daniel's own hand. I have the date. I have the section numbers." "You have paper." "I have proof." "You have paper," Crow said again, softer, "and paper burns." The words landed in the room like a stone in a well. A few men shifted. Somebody's boot scuffed the floor and went still. Clara did not blink. "Is that a threat, Sheriff?" "It's the weather, ma'am." He spread his hands. "Just telling you how the wind blows out here." "Then I'll ask plain, and you can answer plain in front of all these men." She lifted her voice so it carried to the walls. "Where is my husband's ledger? The one with the coffee stain on the spine and his initials carved in the cover. The one that was in his belongings when they were brought back to town and gone by the time they reached me." Crow stood. He did it slowly, unfolding himself from the chair, and she saw the men nearest him lean away without quite knowing they'd done it. He came around the table. He was close now, close enough that she could smell the bay rum on him, could see the fine broadcloth of his coat, the polish on his boots, the manicured cruelty of a man who had made this town love him. "You want to know how it works here, Mrs. Whitmore?" His voice dropped meant just for her, though the whole room strained to hear it. A widow comes to Red Ash Crossing asking questions, loud questions, in front of decent folk who got minds to run and families to feed and no interest in her troubles. He tilted his head, and that widow starts to wonder why nobody's helping her, why doors shut, why the stage back to Denver's always full. His smile thinned. And then one morning that widow don't wake up at all, and folks say, well, she was grieving, wasn't she? Broken-hearted. These things happen. You'd kill me, Clara said, for a book. I'd do nothing at all, Crow said. That's the beauty of it, ma'am. I never have to. And then he hit her. It was not a punch. A punch would have been almost respectful. He swept his arm and caught her across the shoulder, and the collarbone hard a backhand blow with the weight of his whole body behind it, and Clara Whitmore left her feet. She went down. The floor came up and took her palms first, then her hip, then her cheek, scraped the rough board, and she tasted blood and dust together. Her hat rolled away. Somewhere the satchel hit the ground and spilled a fold of papers across the boards. And 30 men watched, and 30 men said nothing. That was the part she would remember. Not the fall, the silence, the scrape of a chair as someone decided to look elsewhere. The clink of a bottle set down careful and quiet. A whole room of American men, sons and husbands and fathers watching a widow bleed on the floor of a saloon, and every last one of them finding something very interesting to study in the grain of his own table. Now! Crow crouched down over her elbows on his knees, patient. You gather up your papers, Mrs. Whitmore, and you get on the morning stage. And you thank the good Lord I'm a Christian man who don't hold with hurtin' women more than the situation strictly requires. Clara lay still for a moment. She could feel her pulse in her split lip. She could feel the grit under her palms. She could feel more than anything the eyes of every coward in that room sliding over her and away. And something in her that had been bending for 2 years, bending under the fever that took Daniel, bending under the empty claim book, bending under the long silence of every letter that went unanswered. Something in her stopped bending. She put her hands flat on the floor. She pushed. No, Crow said, mild. Stay down, ma'am. It's better for... Clara rose. She came up slow, one knee at a time, blood on her cheek, dust down the front of her dress, her hair come loose on one side. She did not reach for his help, and she did not reach for her papers. She stood, and she straightened her spine one vertebra at a time, until she was looking Silas Crow in the eye, and she said in a voice that carried to every silent man in that room, I came for my husband's ledger, not for your mercy. The lamp chain ticked, and behind her at the far end of the bar, a chair scraped back. It was a small sound. A single leg dragged across the boards, slow and deliberate the way a man moves when he wants you to hear him move. But in that dead quiet room, it went off like a gunshot, and every head in the rusted spur turned toward it. The man who stood up had been sitting alone. Nobody had paid him much mind when Clara came in, because that was the way he liked it. He wore a long trail coat, the color of old ash, and a hat pulled low, and there was a gray in his dark stubble that a man earns rather than grows. He set his glass down on the bar without a sound. He did not hurry. He tipped his hat back with one finger so the light could find his face, and then he looked at Sheriff Silas Crow the way a man looks at something he has already decided about. You dropped something, ma'am. His voice was quiet and even and had gravel in the bottom of it. He nodded at the papers scattered on the floor. Reckon a lady ought not have to pick her own things up off a barroom floor. This ain't your concern, stranger, Crow said. No. The man agreed easily. It surely ain't. And he started walking anyway. He crossed the room without haste, and men got out of his way, the same as they'd gotten out of Clara's, but different because this getting out of the way had fear in it. He crouched and he gathered the fallen papers with a care that seemed strange in hands that big squaring the edges, and he stood and held them out to Clara. "Ma'am?" She took them. Her fingers were steady now. She had decided they would be. "You've got blood on your face," he said. "I'm aware." The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile, something in the neighborhood of one. "I expect you are." "I don't know you," Clara said. "No, ma'am." "Then why?" "Mercer," Crow said. The sheriff's voice had changed. The oil had gone out of it. "That's who that is, Mrs. Whitmore, in case you're wondering whose grave you're standing next to. Caleb Mercer. There's paper on him in 3 territories." Crow's hand had drifted casual toward his own hip. "Ask anybody in this room. Ask 'em what Caleb Mercer is." "He's an outlaw," said a voice from the crowd, low, frightened. "He's a killer," said another. Caleb Mercer did not turn around. He kept his eyes on the sheriff, and he answered the room without looking at it. "That's about the size of it," he said. "I've been called worse, and by better men than any I see standing here watching a woman bleed." He let that sit, let it move through the crowd, watched a few faces go red, and a few more go pale. Funny thing about a room full of decent folk, not a one of 'em decent enough to stand up. Took the town killer to do it. He tilted his head. "You want to think on that tonight, gentlemen? All of you." "Mercer!" Crow's voice was tight now. "You are one man. In my town, in my saloon, full of my people." "Your people." Caleb almost sounded amused. "You keep saying that word. Your town, your people, your paper burns." Now he did turn just his head, and he looked at Clara. "Sounds to me, ma'am, like a man who owns a thing is awful worried about somebody coming to take it back." Crow drew. He was fast. Clara would think about that later. How fast, how smooth. How the polished sheriff's gun cleared leather like it had done it 1,000 times, and maybe it had. Crow was fast. Caleb Mercer was already faster. Nobody in the rusted spur saw his hand move. One instant, it hung at his side, empty loose. The next instant, there was a revolver in it, cocked and level, and steady as a fence post. The muzzle a black hole pointed square at the center of Silas Crow's chest, and Crow's own gun only half out of its holster. Frozen there because the sheriff was fast, but he was not a fool, and a fool was the only kind of man who finished a draw against a gun already aimed at his heart. The room made a sound, a collective indrawn breath. Chairs scraped as men lurched back out of the line of fire. "Now," Caleb said, and his voice hadn't changed at all, quiet and gravelly and calm as a man discussing the price of grain. "Go on and finish it, Sheriff. I'd like that. Been a long dusty road and I could use a reason." He let the silence stretch. "Or you can set that iron back where it lives, and we'll all go home tonight." Crow's jaw worked. A vein stood out on his temple. His hand trembled on the grip of his gun, not from fear, Clara thought, but from wanting. He wanted so badly to finish it. She could see the arithmetic running behind his eyes, cold and quick. The calculation of a man who had built an empire on knowing when to strike and when to smile. He smiled. He let the gun slide back into its holster and lifted his hand away. Fingers spread, and he smiled that good, easy smile at the room, like the whole thing had been a misunderstanding among friends. "Boys," he said, "put your drinks down. Show's over. Man's got a right to walk a lady to the door if he wants to get himself hung for it." He looked at Clara, and the smile did not touch his eyes. "You've had your say, Mrs. Whitmore. You had it loud. Now I've given you till the mornin' stage, and I'm a man of my word, so I'll not lay a hand on you again tonight." A beat. "Tonight." "Come on, ma'am," Caleb said. His gun had vanished back under the ash-colored coat as smooth as it came out. "Air's better outside." Clara bent, picked up her satchel, and set the recovered papers inside it. She picked up her hat. She did not hurry, and she did not run, and she made herself walk to the door of that saloon with her chin up and blood drying on her cheek past the 30 men who had watched her fall, and she looked each one of them full in the face as she passed one after another until they looked away. Every single one of them looked away. The night air outside hit her like cold water, and only then in the dark, out of their sight, did she let herself breathe. Caleb Mercer stood on the boardwalk a few feet off, rolling a cigarette he did not light, watching the street. "You shouldn't have done that," Clara said. "Reckon I've heard that before." "He'll come after you now." "He was already after me." Caleb ran his tongue along the paper. "Been after me 6 weeks. Just didn't know it was mutual." He tucked the cigarette behind his ear. "You all right?" "No." She pressed the back of her hand to her lip, and it came away red. "But I will be." "That's so." "That's so." He studied her in the light that fell out through the saloon window, and there was something careful in the way he did it, like a man reading a trail. "You knew he'd knock you down," he said. "It wasn't a question. You walked in there knowing." Clara said nothing. "You wanted the room to see it." Caleb almost laughed low in his chest, a rusty sound like a hinge that hadn't turned in years. 30 witnesses to the sheriff striking a widow. That's a bold play, ma'am. That's the kind of play a person makes when she's got no cards and decides to make her own." He shook his head slowly. "That's either the smartest thing I seen all year or the stupidest, and I'll be damned if I can tell which." "It doesn't matter what you can tell," Clara said. "I don't know you, Mr. Mercer, and everything I've heard in the last 5 minutes tells me I shouldn't want to. So I'll thank you for standing up, and I'll say goodnight, and I'll be gone before the morning stage." "Yeah, I heard." He pushed off the post he'd been leaning against. "Except you ain't getting on the morning stage, are you?" "I never said—" "You didn't ride 3 days to get knocked down once and quit." He said it flat sure. "You came for a book. You still ain't got the book." He looked at her. "So you're staying. Which means, come morning, you're gonna need somebody who knows where the bodies are buried in this town. And I mean that in more ways than the polite one. And that's you. That's me. Why?" The word came out harder than she meant it. She was tired and her face hurt, and she had learned in 2 years of widowhood that when a man offered to help a woman for free, the price simply hadn't been named yet. "You don't know me. You don't owe me. Men like you don't do a kindness without a reason, so name it. What do you want out of Daniel Whitmore's ledger?" Caleb Mercer was quiet for a long moment. When he answered, he wasn't looking at her. He was looking down the dark street toward the far end of town, where a low stone building sat with a single lamp burning in the window. 2 years ago," he said, "a man named Whitmore hired me. Not your husband. His brother." He glanced at her. "You didn't know he had a brother out here." Clara went very still. "Daniel never spoke of—" "No, I don't expect he did. It weren't a proud thing." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Isaac Whitmore. Rode with a rough crowd. Rode with me for a spell. He got word his brother struck Silver up on the ridge, and he came out to shake him down for a piece of it, and instead, he found his brother dead of a fever that came on awful fast and awful convenient. He let that hang in the cold air. Isaac started asking questions, same questions you're asking. Then one night, Isaac went into the land office to get proof, and Isaac didn't come out. Crow killed him. Crow had him killed. There's a difference, and it's the difference that's kept the sheriff's hands clean and his neck out of a rope for 2 years. Caleb finally looked at her full on, and in the spill of lamplight, she saw something in his face she hadn't expected. Not the cold of a killer, but the banked heat of a man carrying a long fire. "I've been hunting proof of it ever since. 6 weeks in this town wearing a false name, waiting for one loose thread I could pull. And tonight, it walks in the front door of the Rusted Spur in a black dress with a filing receipt in her satchel." He shook his head. "So no, ma'am. I don't do kindness without a reason. My reason's named Isaac, and he's in a hole outside town that ain't even got a stone on it, and your husband's ledger is the one thing on this earth that ties the sheriff to both their deaths." He tipped his hat. "That plain enough for you?" Clara looked at him a long time. The wind moved down the street and lifted the dust and let it settle again. Somewhere a dog barked twice and quit. Behind them, muffled through the saloon walls, the piano had started up again, tinny and false, the sound of 30 men pretending nothing had happened. "Daniel didn't die of a fever," she said, quietly, like saying it out loud made it real. "I always knew. In my bones I knew. He was strong as a mule, and he'd never been sick a day. And then a letter comes saying the fever took him in 3 days, and by the time I got here, he was already in the ground, and his belongings already gone through, and his claim already erased." Her voice caught just once, and she mastered it. 2 years, Mr. Mercer. 2 years everybody's told me I was a grieving woman seeing plots where there was only bad luck. 2 years. And now a wanted man tells me my husband was murdered, and it's the first thing anybody said to me in 2 years that I believe. She almost laughed, and it came out cracked. "God help me." "He generally don't, in my experience," Caleb said. "But we can try to help ourselves." He nodded down the street toward a 2-story building with a hand-painted sign. "Hale House. Beatrice Hale runs it. She's a widow too. Her husband was the land clerk before Crow's man Reed took over. She's the only soul in this town who'll rent you a room and not send word to the sheriff before your bag's unpacked." He started walking. "Come on. You need somewhere to sleep that ain't the open road. And I need to not be standin' in a lit window when Crow changes his mind about waitin' till mornin'." Clara did not move. "You said 48 hours. He stopped. "I didn't say that. He did. Till the mornin' stage." "No." She shook her head. "He said the records go to Denver to be burned. When—" Caleb went still. "Where'd you hear that?" "I didn't hear it. I read it." She pulled a folded paper from the satchel, one of the ones he'd gathered off the floor, and handed it back for him to see. It was a freight bill, and she'd taken it off the land office counter herself, an hour before she'd ever walked into the saloon, before she'd let Crow see her at all. Red Ash Mining Company. A crate of records, consigned to a Denver office shipping on the Thursday coach. Her eyes met his. "Today's Tuesday, Mr. Mercer. It's near midnight, which means whatever's in that land office, the ledger, the real claim book, the proof your Isaac died for, it leaves this town in about 48 hours. And after that, it's ash, same as he promised, same as he said. Paper burns." Caleb Mercer looked down at the freight bill in his hand, and then he looked at the widow standing in front of him, with blood on her face and steel in her voice, and something shifted in him. Some old, tired, cynical thing that had spent 2 years believing he was the only man in the West who still cared about the truth, and had just discovered he was wrong. "You lifted this off the counter," he said slowly, "before you ever went into that saloon." "I did." "You knew the deadline before you let him hit you." "I did." "Then why in God's name," he said, "did you let him hit you at all?" And Clara Whitmore for the first time that night smiled. It hurt her split lip, and she did it anyway. "Because a book that goes missing is a mystery," she said. "But a sheriff who beats a widow in front of 30 men? That's a witness. 30 of them. And a witness is the one thing a man like Crow can't burn." She took the freight bill back and folded it into her satchel with the careful hands of a woman who had spent her whole married life keeping her husband's accounts in order. Every figure squared, every entry, dated every page, a small unbreakable fact. "I don't fight the way he fights. Mr. Mercer, I've got no gun, and I've got no gang, and I've got no badge. I've got a receipt and a freight bill and 30 men who watched him show the whole town exactly what he is." Her chin came up. "And now I've got 48 hours, so we had best not waste them standing in the dark." Caleb Mercer looked at her for one more long moment. Then he did something Clara had not seen him do all night. He smiled a real one, slow and surprised, cutting through the gray stubble and the road dust and the 2 years of hard weather in his face, and he touched the brim of his hat to her the way a man does to something he has decided to respect. "Whitmore Silver Works," he said. "What?" "Nothin'." He turned toward Hale House and the single burning lamp in its window and the long 48 hours waiting on the other side of the dark. Just a thing I'll tell you about someday, ma'am, if we both live long enough for someday to come. He glanced back over his shoulder. You comin' or not? The night ain't gettin' any younger, and neither God knows am I. And Clara Whitmore picked up her satchel and lifted her chin and followed the outlaw down the dark street of a town that had watched her fall and would, before this was finished, watch her rise. Behind them, in the lit window of the Rusted Spur Saloon, Sheriff Silas Crow stood with a glass of whiskey he did not drink, watching the two figures move off into the dark, and the good, easy smile was gone from his face entirely. He set the glass down. He turned to the frightened deputy hovering at his elbow. That crate, Crow said. The Denver crate. Sheriff, move it up. His voice was very soft and very cold, and the deputy went white to hear it. I don't care what it costs. I don't care who you wake. That crate ships tomorrow night, not Thursday. He looked back out the window at the empty street where the widow and the killer had gone. Woman's got no idea what she's walked into. But that man does. A muscle moved in his jaw. Mercer knows exactly what's in that box, and I'll be damned before I let a dead man's brother put a rope around my neck. He picked the whiskey back up, and this time he drank it, all of it, in one swallow. 48 hours, he murmured to the dark glass. We'll just see about that. The lamp in the window of Hale House was still burning when they reached the door, and Clara had barely lifted her hand to knock before it swung open from the inside. Get in, both of you, quick now. The woman who said it was gray-haired and broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had stopped asking the world to be gentle a long time ago. She had a shawl thrown over her nightdress, and a shotgun leaned in the corner behind her, where a caller could see it without being told what it meant. Mrs. Hale, Caleb said, tipping his hat. Don't you Mrs. Hale me, Mercer, you brought trouble to my door at midnight? But she was already pulling Clara inside by the sleeve, and her eyes had gone soft and furious, both at once, when she saw the blood on the widow's cheek. Lord above, he hit you. In the saloon, word's already up and down the street. She shut the door and threw the bolt. Sit her down. Sit down, child, before you fall down. I've got water on. I'm all right, Clara said. You're bleedin' on my floor is what you are. Beatrice Hale pressed a wet cloth into Clara's hand and folded the widow's fingers around it with her own. Hold that to your lip. Press. Don't be brave about it. Bravery don't stop bleedin'. She stepped back and looked at the two of them, and her mouth flattened into a hard line. You're the Whitmore woman. Clara's head came up. How do you? Because I've been waitin' 2 years for you to come. Beatrice's voice cracked right down the middle. 2 years I've prayed somebody who loved that poor murdered man would ride into this town and ask the question out loud that I've been too scared to ask. And here you are with your face split open, and I'll tell you plain I'm ashamed. Ashamed it took a stranger to shame me into it. Caleb went still by the door. You knew Whitmore was murdered. I know a great deal, Mr. Mercer. Beatrice pulled a chair around and sat down heavy, like her knees had finally given out under the weight of something she'd carried too long. My husband was the land clerk in this town for 11 years. Ezra Hale, honest as the day. And that honesty is what put him in the ground 8 months after your husband, Mrs. Whitmore, and I have never once believed his heart just stopped in his sleep, any more than you believe your Daniel took a fever. The room went quiet, except for the kettle beginning to sing. Tell me, Clara said. I'll do better than tell you. Beatrice heaved herself back up. I'll show you. But you listen to me first, girl, and you listen good, because once I put this thing in your hand, there's no unknowing it, and there's men in this town who'll kill you for the knowing. She looked at Caleb. Both of you. You understand what I'm saying? The minute I open that drawer, we're all three of us walking dead unless we win. There ain't no middle road left after tonight. Ma'am, Caleb said quietly, I've been walking dead for 2 years. I'd just as soon get on with the winning. Beatrice looked at him a long moment. Then she nodded once and crossed to the sideboard and knelt and pried up a loose board in the floor beneath it with a butter knife she kept there for exactly that purpose. From the dark hollow underneath, she drew out a flat tin box, and from the tin box, a single folded letter, yellowed at the creases, the ink gone brown with age. My Ezra wrote this the week before he died, she said. He didn't tell me what was in it. He just said if anything happened to him, I was to keep it hid and give it to the first honest law that ever came through Red Ash Crossing. Her hand shook as she held it out. Well, no honest law ever came. But you came. So I reckon you'll have to do. Clara took the letter. She unfolded it with the wet cloth still pressed to her lip, and she read it by lamplight, with Caleb reading over her shoulder, and the further down the page her eyes went, the whiter her face became. Read it out loud, Caleb said. I want to hear it in the air. Clara's voice was steady when she started, and not steady when she finished. To whoever finds this, my name is Ezra Hale, Land Clerk of Red Ash Crossing, and I am writing down a crime I helped bury, and now cannot live beside. In the fall of 1881, a surveyor named Daniel Whitmore filed a silver claim on the North Ridge Section 19 legal, and paid and stamped in my own hand. 2 weeks later, Sheriff Silas Crow came to my office after dark and ordered me to strike the claim from the book and enter a false claim in the name of the Red Ash Mining Company, of which I have since learned the sheriff owns a secret third share. I refused. He did not argue. He told me my wife took the same road home every evening past the stable, and he asked whether the lanterns out that way had been trimmed lately, on account of a dark road being a dangerous thing for a woman alone. Clara stopped. Her throat worked. Go on, Caleb said. So I did it. God forgive me, I did it. I struck an honest man's claim, and I forged a lie in its place to keep my Beatrice alive, and I have hated myself every hour since. And when Whitmore's brother came asking questions, I said nothing. And now that boy is dead in the ground too, and I know I am next, because Crow has stopped smiling at me in the street. I am leaving this, so that someone someday will know the claim was real, the murder was ordered, and the man who did it wears a star. The true survey ledger is not destroyed. Crow kept it. A man like him keeps everything he might one day need to hang somebody else. It is in the iron safe in the back room of the land office, and I am the last man alive who knows the combination, and I will carry it to the grave he is about to dig me. God help my soul. Ezra Hale. Nobody spoke. Then Caleb Mercer let out a slow breath and said the thing all three of them were thinking. The ledger's still here. His voice had gone rough. It's 10 feet from where I've been drinking every night for 6 weeks. It's in that safe. It's in that safe, Beatrice agreed. Behind a combination that died with my husband in a room the sheriff's deputy sleeps outside of in a building Crow's got 2 men watching since the day your brother-in-law broke in and never came out. She looked at Clara. So you tell me, girl, you got your 48 hours. You got your proof it's real. But how in God's name do you open a locked iron safe that only a dead man knew the number to? And Clara Whitmore, who had spent 11 years keeping her surveyor husband's books, who could add a column of figures faster than a bank clerk, and had never in her life met a number she couldn't reason her way toward, folded Ezra Hale's letter along its old creases, and said very quietly, every man who owns a safe writes the number down somewhere, because every man is afraid of forgetting it. She lifted her eyes. Even Silas Crow, especially Silas Crow. Men like that trust nobody, not even their own memory. She set the letter down on the table between them. We don't need to guess the number. We need to find where he hid it. And a man hides a thing like that close, real close, somewhere he can put his hands on it in the dark. His office, Caleb said. Or his person, Clara said. Or someplace he thinks nobody would ever dare look. She was quiet a moment. Mrs. Hale, who cuts the sheriff's hair? Beatrice blinked. What in the world does that, who cuts it? Otto. Otto Bell. Old deaf man's had the barber shop 30 years, cuts every man in this town. Why on earth? Because a man talks in a barber's chair, Clara said, the way he talks nowhere else, leaned back, throat bare, trusting. He talks to hear himself, and he never once thinks about the man standing behind him with the razor, because that man is furniture to him. That man is deaf. Her eyes sharpened. But a deaf man reads the room, Mrs. Hale. A deaf man watches lips his whole life because he's got no other choice. And a deaf man behind a sheriff's chair for 30 years has seen every secret in this town walk right past his eyes and never known it was seen. Beatrice Hale sat down slowly. "My lord," she whispered. "Otto." "Where does he live?" "Behind the shop." "But—" Beatrice caught Clara's wrist. "Child, it's near 1 in the morning. You can't go banging on." "I've got 47 hours," Clara said and stood. She swayed. Caleb caught her elbow before she knew she was falling, and for a second, the whole hard day caught up to her at once. The stage, the fall, the blood, the letter. And she leaned into a stranger's hand because her legs had quit asking her permission. "Easy," Caleb said, low, just for her. "Easy, ma'am. Otto Bell's been sitting on his secret for 2 years. He'll keep till dawn." His grip was steady under her arm. "You go 1 more hour without sleep, you'll walk into that safe room and faint into it. Then where are we?" He eased her back into the chair. "Mrs. Hale's got a bed. You take it. I'll sit up. You don't trust the door. I don't trust the town." He crossed to the window and looked out at the dark street, and his hand rested easy on the grip of his gun. "You did a bold thing tonight, Mrs. Whitmore. Boldest I ever saw. And bold things have a way of making a man like Crow do something rash before he means to." He didn't turn around. "So you sleep. I'll watch. And in the morning we'll go pay a call on a deaf man who's been screaming the truth for 2 years with nobody to hear him." Clara slept. She hadn't meant to, and she'd have sworn she couldn't. But the moment her head touched the pillow in Beatrice Hale's narrow spare room, the 2 years of holding herself upright let go all at once, and she went down into a black, dreamless sleep, like a stone into a well. When she woke, it was gray dawn, and there was a cold biscuit and hot coffee on the stool by the bed, and propped against the coffee cup, a note in a rough, uneven hand. "Gone to see about the crate. Don't go to Otto's alone. Wait for me. M." Clara read it twice. Then she drank. The coffee ate the biscuit, put on her boots, checked that Ezra Hale's letter and Daniel's filing receipt and the freight bill were all safe in her satchel, and went to see Otto Bell alone. The barber shop wasn't open. She knocked anyway 3 times, then 3 times harder, and she was raising her fist for a 3rd round when the door cracked, and a roomy blue eye looked out at her over a chain. "We're closed," the old man said too loud, the flat, overloud voice of a man who's never heard his own words. "Come back at—" "Mr. Bell?" Clara stepped so the gray dawn light fell full on her face, on her split lip, and the bruise going yellow-green along her cheekbone, and she said it slow and clear so he could read every letter off her mouth. "My name is Clara Whitmore. Daniel Whitmore was my husband." The old man went absolutely still. The roomy eye moved over her face, her mouth reading, and then it dropped to the bruise, and something crumpled in the deep folds of the ancient face. Some grief long dammed up, going soft at the edges. "Whitmore," Otto Bell said. Softer now, almost a whisper, which for a deaf man is a kind of tenderness, the deliberate quieting of a voice he can't hear. "You're his. You come. After all this while you come." The chain rattled off. The door opened. "Get in off the street, girl, quick, for somebody sees you at my door and wonders why." Inside the shop smelled of bay rum and shaving soap and old leather, and Otto Bell latched the door behind her and pulled the shade down over the window with a hand that shook, and then he turned and looked at her. This small, stooped, ancient man, and his chin was trembling. "I saw it," he said. "You come here for that. I can see it in your face. You already know somehow, and I'll tell you 'fore you even ask. I saw it. I've been carrying it 2 years, and I'm too old to carry it another day." He sank into his own barber chair like his strings had been cut. "Ask me. Whatever it is you come to ask. Ask me, and I'll answer, and God forgive me for not saying it sooner." Clara pulled the second chair around to face him close so he could see her lips, and she took his gnarled old hand in both of hers. "Did you see the sheriff take my husband's ledger?" Otto Bell nodded, and the tears finally came running down into the deep seams of his face. 2 years back. Little after your man died. Crow come in for a shave, like always leaned back in that very chair you're pullin' round, and I'm workin' the razor. And he's talking to his deputy, who's standing by the door. That Reed boy weren't but a pup then, and Crow don't think a thing of it, 'cause old Otto's deaf as a post, ain't he? Old Otto's just a pair of hands with a razor. The old man's mouth twisted. But I watch Lips, girl. I watched Lips since I was 6 years old with the scarlet fever. I read every word off that man's mouth in the mirror, plain as if he'd hollered it. What did he say? Otto Bell looked her dead in the eye. He said the Whitmore ledger's locked up safe in the office. Nobody opens that book but me. The old man's voice dropped lower. And then that Reed boy asks him his back's to me. I only got half of it, but I got enough. Reed asks him something about the widow. About you, girl. About whether you'd come lookin'. Otto's hand tightened on hers, cold and shaking. And Crow, he leans back in my chair, with his throat bare under my razor, and he smiles, and he says it clear as church bells. Says what? This settles the widow problem, Otto Bell said. She'll take the fever story, or she'll join him under it. Either way, that book buries the both of 'em. Clara sat back. For a long moment, she couldn't speak. It was one thing to reason a murder from a letter, and a freight bill, and a missing page. It was another thing entirely to hear a dead man's own confessed words come out of a living witness's mouth, to know that Silas Crow had leaned back in a chair with a razor at his throat, and joked about killing her the same as he'd joked about the weather. You'd swear to that, she said finally. In front of a judge, you'd swear you read those words off his lips. Girl, I'll swear it, sign it, and shout it deaf as I am. Otto Bell wiped his face with the back of his hand. I've had 2 years of praying for the chance and hating myself for not making one. You think I don't know what I am? I stood behind that man's chair 100 times since shaved his throat 100 times, and every time I thought about how easy the razor'd slip, and every time I was too much a coward to do it or to speak it. His voice broke. You come in here with your face broke open and you make an old coward feel his cowardice. So yes, I'll swear it. Put me in front of your judge. There's no judge yet, Clara said gently. But there will be. And when there is... The door rattled. Not a knock. A hand on the latch testing, and then a fist, 3 sharp raps, and a young man's voice tight and low. Otto! Otto, you in there? Open up, it's Reed. It's damn it, old man. I know you can't hear me open the... Otto Bell had gone gray. That's him, he whispered. That's the deputy. The Reed boy. Girl, you got to... But Clara was already moving. She crossed to the door and threw back the latch and opened it and stood square in the gap and looked up into the startled face of a young man in a dented deputy's badge who plainly had not expected to find the beaten widow from the saloon standing in the barber's doorway at dawn. You, Thomas Reed said. Me, Clara agreed. The deputy was young, 28 maybe, with a soft face going hard before its time, and eyes that darted past her into the shop and back like a man who'd learned to check every room for the thing that was going to hurt him. His hand was nowhere near his gun. That was the first thing Clara noticed. A man come to do the sheriff's dirty work keeps his hand by his gun. This one had his hat crushed in both fists. You can't be here, he said. You don't understand. If Crow knew you was talking to Otto... Crow hit me in front of 30 men last night, deputy. I don't reckon there's much worse he can do to me that he ain't already promised. She didn't move out of the doorway. The question is, what he can do to you. Because you're standing at a deaf man's door at dawn whispering checking the street, and I don't think you came to arrest anybody. I think you came to warn him. Reed's face did something complicated. You don't know what it's like, he said, low. Working for that man. You think I wanted this badge I was 19 when he pinned it on me. Told me it was a fine thing, a proud thing. By the time I understood what he really wanted a deputy for, I was already in it up to my neck. And a man in up to his neck don't get to climb out, ma'am. He only gets to sink or push somebody else under to keep his own head up. His voice cracked. I've done things. 2 years of things. I ain't never killed nobody. I swear that before God. But I've stood in doorways while it happened, and I've signed papers I knew was lies, and I've watched... He stopped. His jaw worked. I watched them carry your husband's brother out of that land office wrapped in a tarp, and I wrote in the book he died of a fall from his horse, and I knew it weren't true, and I wrote it anyway. Silence. Behind Clara, Otto Bell couldn't hear a word of it, but he was reading the boy's lips in the mirror over Clara's shoulder, and the old man's face had gone slack with a terrible understanding. Then help me, Clara said quietly. Whatever you've done, Deputy, you can stop doing it right now, this morning. You can be the man who finally told the truth instead of the man who finally got caught. Those are your two roads, and there ain't a third, and you know it because you've known it for 2 years, and it's why you can't sleep. She stepped toward him. I saw your hands when I opened this door. You weren't reaching for your gun. You were twisting your hat like a boy about to be whipped. That's not a killer, Thomas Reed. That's a man who wants out. The deputy's eyes were wet. He moved the crate, Reed blurted. That's what I come to tell Otto so Otto could get word to whoever I didn't. Crow moved it up. It don't ship Thursday no more. He's sending the whole crate of records to Denver tonight. Tonight, ma'am, after dark, on a private wagon with 2 guns riding it, and once it's gone, it's gone. It's ash in some Denver stove by morning, and there won't be a scrap of paper left in this whole territory that says Silas Crow ever did one wrong thing in his life. The floor seemed to tilt under Clara. 47 hours had just become 15. The ledger too, she said. The survey ledger. Is it in the crate? I don't know. I ain't allowed in the safe room. Only Crow's got them. But he'll pack it. He'll pack everything. He wouldn't leave the one book that hangs him sittin' in a safe in a town he's fixin' to be investigated in. Her mind was racing now, cold and fast, the way it ran down a column of figures. He's clearing the safe tonight to load that crate, which means tonight is the one night that safe gets opened. Tonight's the night the ledger comes out of the iron and into the wagon. She looked at Reed. What time does the wagon leave? Midnight. He wants it clear of town before folks are moving. And between now and midnight, that safe gets opened by the only man who knows the combination, and everything in it gets carried out and boxed up. Clara turned it over fast, all the angles. We don't need the combination anymore. We don't need to crack the safe. We need to be there when he empties it. Ma'am, there'll be guards, there'll be... Deputy. Clara took his twisting hands in hers and made him look at her. Are you one of the 2 guns riding that wagon tonight? Thomas Reed went very white and very still, and Clara knew the answer before he said it. He assigned me this morning, Reed whispered. Me and Dutch Kavanaugh. We're to ride the crate to Denver and see it burned and never speak of it again. Clara Whitmore smiled, and it was not a kind smile, and it was the first time all morning Otto Bell, reading her lips in the mirror, saw the woman that Silas Crow had made a mistake in knocking down. Then God's put you exactly where I need you, she said. You're gonna ride that wagon, Thomas Reed. You're gonna do everything Crow told you, right up until the moment you don't. The deputy's breath came ragged. If he even suspects if Kavanaugh sees me, then you'd best be a better liar tonight than you've ever been in your life, because you've had 2 years of practice being one. She released his hands. Now go. Go before somebody sees your horse tied at a barber shop. Do your mourning like nothing's changed. And tonight when they open that safe, you keep your eyes on where the ledger goes. Coffee stain on the spine initials carved in the cover. You mark it. You remember it. And when the time's right, you and I are going to make sure that book never sees Denver. Reed stared at her. Then slowly some of the animal fear went out of his young face, and something else came into it, something she recognized because she'd felt it herself the night before walking into that saloon. The particular calm that comes over a person the moment they finally stop running and turn to face the thing. My daddy was a preacher, Reed said out of nowhere quiet. He used to say a man gets one chance in his life to be brave, and most men are looking the other way when it comes. He put his crushed hat back on his head and squared it. Reckon I've been looking the other way 2 years, ma'am. Reckon I'd like to look at it straight for once before I die. He touched the brim to her. Midnight. I'll mark the book. And he was gone off down the alley with his shoulders a little straighter than they'd come, and Clara shut the door and leaned against it and let out a long breath. "Well," said a voice behind her, "I told you to wait for me." Caleb Mercer was standing at the back of the shop. He'd come in the rear door through Otto's living quarters, silent as smoke, and God alone knew how long he'd been there, but from the look on his face, it had been long enough. He had his hat in his hand, and his coat dusted with mourning, and an expression Clara couldn't quite read. "You heard," she said. "Every word?" He turned his hat in his hands. "Crate ships tonight. Reed's riding it. And you just turned Silas Crow's own guard into our man on the inside, without so much as raising your voice." He shook his head slowly. "Mrs. Whitmore, I have known some hard, cold, clever operators in my life. Rode with a few, hunted more. And I want you to know, I ain't never in all my born days seen anybody work a room the way you just worked that boy." "I didn't work him. I told him the truth. That's the part that scares me." Caleb crossed the shop. He nodded to Otto Bell, who was watching them both with wet eyes, and the old man nodded back, one witness to another. "The crate moving up, that's Crow getting scared. That's a rat smelling the trap." He stopped in front of her. "Which means I got something to tell you, and you ain't gonna like it, and I need you to hear all of it before you go doing something brave." Something in his voice put ice down her spine. "What?" Caleb reached into his coat. He brought out a folded paper, and Clara knew before she saw it that it was trouble, because he held it the way a man holds a thing he wishes he didn't have to hand over. "I went to see about the crate this morning," he said. "Poked around the freight office, and I found the wagon, and I found the 2 guns, and I found the manifest, same as you'd figure." He unfolded the paper. "But I found something else. Something that changes the whole shape of this thing." He looked up at her, and his eyes were grave. "That crate ain't going to Denver to be burned, Mrs. Whitmore. That's a story Crow told his own men. It's going to Denver, all right. But it ain't getting burned." He held the paper out. "It's getting delivered to an office on Larimer Street, to a man named of Ambrose Vane." Clara took the paper. Read it. Didn't understand. "Who's Ambrose Vane?" "Ambrose Vane," Caleb said slowly, "is the president of the Red Ash Mining Company, and he is also a muscle worked in his jaw, the brother-in-law of the territorial governor." The shop went dead quiet. "You're saying—" "I'm saying this ain't just a crooked sheriff in a nothin' town stealing one widow's silver claim." Caleb's voice had gone flat and hard. "I'm saying Silas Crow is the small end of something big. That ledger in your husband's claim and my Isaac in his unmarked hole, that's not the crime, ma'am. That's the loose thread. The crime is a mining company backed by the governor's own family that's been stealing registered claims up and down this territory for years, murdering the folks who filed them and covering it with a network of bought sheriffs of which our friend Crow is just one." He tapped the paper in her hand. "That crate ain't evidence Crow's trying to destroy. It's evidence Crow's trying to hand up the ladder to the men who protect him. Proof of his loyalty. His way of saying, look how clean I keep my county, don't cut me loose." Clara felt the ground shift under everything. "Then it's not 15 hours, she said slowly. "It's not a wagon we have to stop before it burns. It's a wagon we have to stop before it reaches men who can bury this so deep, no judge on earth digs it out. Now you're seeing it. The governor." She pressed her hand to her mouth. "The governor's family. Caleb, if we take that ledger, if we hold it, every lawman in this territory works for the people we're stealing it from. There's no honest law to run to. There's no sheriff, no marshal." "There's a judge," said Otto Bell. They both turned. The old deaf barber had been reading their lips the whole time, following the whole terrible shape of it, and now he pushed himself up out of his chair, trembling but upright. "Circuit Judge," Otto said, too loud urgent. "Harrison Vale. Comes through Red Ash every season to clear the docket. Old man, honest man, the one soul in this territory. Ambrose Vane's money never bought on account of Vale, hates the whole crooked bunch of 'em down to the ground." Otto's rheumy eyes were bright. "And I'll tell you something else, girl. Something I know. 'Cause every man in this town sits in my chair and talks over my head like I'm furniture." He leaned in. "Judge Harrison Vale is due in Red Ash Crossing day after tomorrow. On the very circuit he rides every year. He's already coming. He'll be here in 2 days whether we're ready or not." Clara looked from the old barber to the outlaw and back, and the whole impossible shape of it came together in her mind at once. The crate leaving at midnight, the deputy on the inside, the honest judge riding toward them out of the dark, and Silas Crow sitting at the center of it all thinking he had 2 more days than he did. "Then here's what happens," she said, and her voice had gone very quiet and very sure. "That crate doesn't reach Larimer Street. It doesn't reach Ambrose Vane. It doesn't reach the governor's family or a Denver stove or anywhere at all except one place." She folded the manifest and slid it into her satchel beside the letter and the receipt and the freight bill. One more fact squared away in a widow's careful accounting of everything she was owed. That crate and the ledger inside it is going to be sitting on the table in front of Judge Harrison Vale 2 days from now, with every stolen claim and every murdered man laid open beside it. She looked up. "We don't just save Daniel's claim. We take the whole thing down. Crow the company, all of it. We turn the sheriff's own crate of buried men into the rope that hangs him." Caleb Mercer looked at her for a long moment. "You know what happens if we miss," he said quietly. "If that wagon gets past us tonight, if Reed loses his nerve or Kavanaugh smells it or Crow changes the plan again, you know what happens to a woman who tried to steal a mining company's crate and failed in a town where every gun works for that company." "I know exactly what happens," Clara said. "I've had a good long look at it. It's got a sheriff's boot on the end of it, and 30 men watching, and not one of them lifting a hand." She lifted her chin. "That's why we're not going to miss Mr. Mercer." Otto Bell put his gnarled old hand on her shoulder. "He's been down that whole road, your husband's brother," the old man said softly. "Right up to that safe, right up to the edge of it, and he never come back out." His fingers tightened. "You go down that road tonight, girl. You go down it smarter than Isaac did, and you go down it with a plan, and you go down it knowing that if it goes wrong, old Otto Bell is finally going to testify to what he saw. But a testimony don't do a dead woman no good." The tears stood in his eyes again. "So you come back, whatever else happens tonight. You come back out of that land office, you hear me. I've watched 2 of you Whitmores walk into that building and only 1 walk out. I'm too old to watch it a 3rd time." Clara took the old man's shaking hand off her shoulder and held it in both of hers, and she looked at his lips and made sure her own were clear and slow so he'd catch every word. "I hear you, Otto Bell," she said. "I'm coming back. And when I do, you're going to put on your Sunday coat and you're going to walk into that judge's hearing with your head up. And for the first time in 30 years, the whole town is going to hear what the deaf man saw." She squeezed his hand. "They spent 2 years talking over your head like you were furniture. Day after tomorrow, they're all going to sit down and shut up and listen to you." Otto Bell wept and nodded and did not let go of her hands. Outside the town of Red Ash Crossing was coming awake wagons in the street, shopkeepers throwing open shutters, the ordinary sounds of ordinary people going about ordinary mornings, none of them knowing that a widow, an outlaw, a deaf barber, and a broken deputy had just decided in the back of a shuttered barber shop to burn the whole rotten thing down. Caleb crossed to the front window and lifted the edge of the shade with one finger and looked out at the street and went very still. "Clara." It was the first time he'd used her given name. "What?" "Come look, slow, don't crowd the glass." She came to his shoulder and looked where he was looking down the length of the main street to the low stone building at the far end, where a single lamp had burned the night before. Silas Crow was standing in the door of the land office. He wasn't doing anything. That was what turned Clara's blood to ice water. He was just standing there in the morning light with his thumbs hooked in his gun belt and his good easy smile on his face, and he was looking straight up the street, straight at the barber shop, straight at the shaded window, as though he could see the 2 of them standing behind it plain as day. And as they watched, Sheriff Silas Crow lifted one hand slow and deliberate and tipped his hat toward the barber shop window. Then he turned and went inside and shut the land office door behind him. "He knows," Clara breathed. "He knows something." Caleb let the shade fall. His hand had settled on his gun without his seeming to notice it. "He knows you slept at Hale's. He knows you're at Otto's now. He don't know about Reed or the judge or that we've read the manifest. If he knew that he wouldn't be smiling, he'd be moving the crate again." He turned to her and his face was grim. "But he knows you didn't run. He knows the widow he knocked down got back up and started asking questions all over his town in one night." A muscle worked in his jaw. That was a warning that tipped hat. That was Crow telling you he's watching. And a man like that don't give but one warning. Clara looked at the closed door of the land office at the far end of the street. The stone building with its iron safe and its buried ledger and its 2 dead Whitmores in the ground behind it. And she thought about a sheriff's boot on a saloon floor and a dead man's letter under a widow's floorboards and a deaf man who'd waited 2 years to be heard and a broken deputy who wanted one chance to be brave and a crate rolling toward Denver at midnight with the truth locked inside it. 15 hours. "Let him watch," she said. They spent the day the way soldiers spend the hours before a battle, which is to say quietly and carefully, and with the sick weight of every hour ticking down, pressing on them like a hand. Caleb laid out the plan in the back of Otto's shop low and fast, and it was a simple plan because simple plans were the ones that lived. Reed would ride the wagon out of town at midnight, him and Kavanaugh, one on the seat and one on horseback beside. 2 miles north of Red Ash, crossing the road, bent through a cut in the rocks where a wagon had to slow to a walk. Caleb would be waiting in that cut. He'd take Kavanaugh off his horse quiet if he could, loud if he had to, and with Reed already inside the wagon and turned to their side, 2 guns became 1 gun, became no guns at all. Then they'd bring the crate back, not to the land office and not to Hale House, but to a place Crow would never think to look, and they'd hold it there one single day until Judge Harrison Vale rode into town. "And if it goes loud," Clara said, "then it goes loud and we run and we pray the judge gets here before Crow catches us." Caleb rolled the unlit cigarette between his fingers. "It ain't a good plan, Clara. It's just the only one we got." But Clara Whitmore had spent 11 years keeping books, and a woman who keeps books learns one thing above all others, that the plan on paper is never the plan that happens, and the difference between the two is where everything is either won or lost. So while Caleb watched the road and Otto watched the street, Clara sat in the back of the barber shop with a stub of pencil and a scrap of paper and did what she did best. She ran the figures. She ran them again. And somewhere in the middle of the afternoon, running them for the 4th time, she stopped and set down the pencil and said, "It's wrong." Caleb looked over. "What's wrong?" "The whole thing. It's built on the wagon leaving at midnight." She tapped the paper. "But think, Caleb. Crow tipped his hat at us this morning. He knows I didn't run. He knows I've been to Hale's and to Otto's. He's a careful man, you said it yourself. He moved the crate up the minute he got nervous." She looked up. "So why would a careful man who knows the widow's still in town and asking questions send his crate out at the exact hour he told his own deputy? He wouldn't. He'd move it again, earlier, quieter. He'd send it out when nobody's watching the road because everybody thinks it goes at midnight." Caleb went still. "You're guessing," he said, but there was no conviction in it. "I'm not guessing. I'm doing what he does. I'm being careful." She stood. "If I were Silas Crow, and I'd caught a whiff that this town wasn't as asleep as I needed it, I'd move that crate out in broad daylight when it looked most innocent on an ordinary supply wagon guarded by men who didn't even know what they were carrying. And I'd let the midnight story stand so that anybody fool enough to plan an ambush would be sitting in a rock cut 2 miles north at midnight guarding an empty road." The shop was silent. "We need to know," Caleb said slowly, "when that crate really moves. We need Reed." But Reed didn't come. The afternoon wore on, and the deputy who'd promised to mark the book and ride the wagon did not appear, did not send word, did not so much as walk past the shop. And with every hour that passed, the sick weight pressed harder. Because there were only two reasons a man like Thomas Reed went silent, and one of them was that he'd lost his nerve and run, and the other was worse. It was near 4 in the afternoon when they found out which. The knock came at the back door, 3 raps, and then 2 the signal they'd agreed on, and Clara had the door open before Caleb could stop her, and it wasn't Reed. It was a boy, maybe 10 years old, barefoot and breathless, with a folded scrap of paper clutched in one dirty fist. "Man, give me a nickel to bring this to the barber shop," the boy panted. "Said give it to the lady with the hurt face. Said run." And he shoved the paper into Clara's hand and was gone before she could ask a single question. She unfolded it. Reed's uneven hand scrawled fast, the pencil pressed so hard in places it had torn the paper. "Crow knows I'm turned. Kavanaugh told him I asked too many questions about the crate. They got me in the office." Crow's smiling. "That's the worst part, he keeps smiling. Crate don't go midnight. Goes at dusk on Henderson's supply wagon, looks like flour and feed. 2 men don't know what's in it. Ledger is in it. I saw him pack it myself, coffee stain, bent corner initials. I marked it. It's real, it's in there. Clara, I'm sorry. I think this is the last thing I get to do, Brave. Tell my daddy I finally looked at it straight. Get the crate. Don't come for me. Get the crate." Clara read it twice, and her hand began to shake, and Caleb took it from her and read it once, and his face turned to stone. "Dusk," he said. "Not midnight." She was right. He looked at the window, at the light already going long and gold. "That's Clara, that's less than 2 hours. That ain't near enough time to get to the cut, that ain't. They have Reed." Clara's voice came out strange flat, the voice of a woman holding something down with both hands. "Caleb, they have him in the office, and he wrote, 'Don't come for me,' which means he thinks he's already dead." Caleb's jaw was tight. And he might be right. Crow can't let a turned deputy live to talk to a judge. Reed's the one man besides Otto who can put words in Crow's mouth in a courtroom. He crushed the note in his fist. That boy just signed his own death warrant to get us this note. He knew what it had cost. "We have to get him out. We can't get him out." Caleb rounded on her, and there was anguish under the hardness. "You think I don't want to? That boy did a braver thing today than most men do in a lifetime. But he's inside the land office with Crow and Kavanaugh, and God knows how many guns. And if we go through that door, we die. And if we die, the crate rolls out at dusk and everything Reed just bought us dies with us. He knows that. That's why he wrote, 'Get the crate.' He's telling us the only way to make his dying mean something is to leave him and take the wagon." His voice broke. "Don't come for me. It's the bravest thing anybody's said in this whole rotten town, and it's a knife in my gut, and it's right." Clara stood very still. 2 years ago, a young man had ridden into this town asking questions, and walked into that land office and never come out. And now another young man was inside those same stone walls, and the arithmetic of it. The cold, unbearable arithmetic said, "Leave him. Get the crate. Save the many by spending the one." She had spent her whole life trusting arithmetic. "No," she said. Caleb closed his eyes. "Clara, I'm not doing it your way." She was already moving, pulling her satchel onto her shoulder, and there was something in her face now that made him stop. "Not because you're wrong about the numbers. You're right about the numbers. If it's the crate or the boy, it's the crate. I know that I hate it, but I know it." She looked at him. "But you're thinking like Crow thinks. You're thinking about guns and doors and how many. And that's the one game we always lose, because he's got more guns and more doors and more men than we'll ever have." Her chin came up. "So we don't play that game. We play mine." "And what's your game?" Clara Whitmore smiled, and it was the saloon smile, the one that had frightened Otto Bell. The one that meant she'd found the number nobody else could see. "Paper," she said. "We play paper." She turned to Otto, who'd been reading every word, his old face gray with fear for the deputy. "Otto, that supply wagon, Henderson's. Does it come through town? Does it stop anywhere? The old barber's eyes sharpened following her, and he nodded fast. Stops at the mercantile, always. Loads the real flour and feed there, for it heads out right there on Main Street in front of God and everybody. Henderson's boy loads it, then it rolls. In front of everybody, Clara repeated softly. On Main Street, in daylight. What are you thinking? Caleb said. I'm thinking Crow made a mistake. She turned back to him fast, now the whole thing assembling in her mind at speed. He was so clever hiding that crate among flour and feed on an innocent wagon in broad daylight, but daylight cuts both ways, Caleb. He hid it in plain sight to keep us from ambushing it on a dark road. But plain sight means the whole town sees it. Plain sight means witnesses. Her eyes were bright. He can move a crate through a dark cut and murder anybody who tries to stop it, and nobody ever knows. But he can't murder us on Main Street at dusk in front of the mercantile with 30 townsfolk watching their sheriff shoot a widow over a load of flour. She spread her hands. He built himself a trap, and he built it in the one place he can't use a gun. Caleb stared at her. Slowly understanding dawned across his weathered face. You want to take the crate, he said, on Main Street, in the open, in front of the whole town. I want to make him choose, Clara said, between letting me have it and showing every soul in Red Ash Crossing exactly what he is. The same choice I made him make in the saloon. Except last time, 30 men watched him hit a widow and did nothing. Her voice hardened. This time, I'm going to make them do something. They won't. You saw 'em. They looked away. They looked away because they were alone, Clara said. Every one of those men in the saloon thought he was the only one who wanted to stand up. That's how a man like Crow wins. He makes everybody feel alone. He makes the whole town a room full of strangers too scared to look at each other. She took a breath. But a town's not really a room full of strangers. A town's a place where the barber cut every man's hair, and the hotel widow fed every family through a hard winter, and the deputy's daddy preached half their funerals. A town remembers itself. It just needs one person to remind it. She looked at Otto. And I've got the two people this town can't ignore standing right here in this shop. Otto Bell drew himself up. You want the deaf man to talk, he said, and the widow's widow to walk beside you. I want the two people who this town has wronged and pitied and talked over for years, Clara said gently, to stand in the middle of Main Street at dusk beside a woman with a split lip and dare Silas Crow to knock all three of us down at once in the daylight in front of everyone. She held out her hand to the old man. It's dangerous, Otto. I won't lie to you. He might do it anyway, but I don't think he will. I think a man who spent 10 years buying this town's love can't afford to be seen killing its barber and its hotel keeper and a widow in the street. I think the one thing Silas Crow can't survive is the town seeing itself clearly all at once in the light. The old barber looked at her outstretched hand for a long moment. Then he took off his apron and hung it on its nail and reached past her for the good black Sunday coat that hung by the door. I've been furniture in this town 30 years, Otto Bell said, shrugging into the coat. Reckon it's about time they saw the chair stand up. Caleb Mercer looked at the three of them. The widow, the barber, and himself an outlaw with paper on him in 3 territories, and he shook his head slowly, and something that was almost a laugh came out of him. You know what the flaw is in this plan of yours? He said. The beautiful, insane flaw. Tell me, it only works if you're right about him. If Crow's the careful town-lovin' reputation garden man you've figured him for, then yeah, he lets the crate go, rather than gun down half the town in the street. Caleb checked his revolver, spun the cylinder, and slid it home. But if you're wrong, if underneath that smile he's just a killer who's decided the crate's worth more than his reputation, then you're gonna walk 3 unarmed people into the middle of Main Street and hand him the easiest slaughter of his life. He holstered the gun and looked at her. You'd be betting all our lives on your read of one man's soul. Clara was quiet a moment. I read one man's soul in that saloon last night, she said. I bet my own life he'd hit me instead of shooting me, because a man who shoots a widow in front of 30 men is finished, and a man who slaps one down is just keeping order. I was right about that. She met his eyes. I'm right about this. Silas Crow loves being the man everyone respects more than he loves anything else in this world. That's not his strength, Caleb. It's the crack right down the middle of him. And I'm going to put my whole weight on that crack. Caleb held her gaze a long moment. All right, he said finally. But I ain't standing in the middle of that street unarmed. You three do the daylight and the witnesses and the shaman. I'll be where I always am. He nodded toward the window. In the shadow with a gun close enough to matter if your read of his soul turns out wrong. His voice roughened. And Clara, if it does go wrong, if he draws. You get down, and you stay down, and you let me do the one thing in this world I'm actually good at. You hear? I hear you. Say it. If he draws, I get down. She held his eyes. But he won't draw. God willing, Caleb said, and reached for his hat. The light was going long and gold when they walked out of Otto Bell's barber shop, and Main Street was full of the ordinary bustle of a frontier town at the end of a working day. And there, down at the Mercantile, exactly as Reed's note had promised, sat Henderson's supply wagon, and Henderson's boy was loading the last sacks of flour onto the back of it, and half buried under a tarp between the feed sacks was a plain pine crate that nobody in the street was paying the slightest attention to. Clara Whitmore walked down the middle of Main Street toward it. She did not hurry. She walked slow and straight down the center of the road with her satchel on her shoulder, and her split lip and her yellow-green bruise, and on her right walked Otto Bell in his Sunday coat, and on her left walked nobody yet, because the third of them hadn't joined the line, but heads were turning. That was the thing. Heads were turning all up and down the street, because everybody in Red Ash Crossing knew about the saloon by now. Everybody had heard how the sheriff knocked the widow down, and 30 men watched. And here she was, the very next evening, walking down the middle of Main Street, with her bruise showing, and the deaf barber at her side, like a man marching to war. Mrs. Hale, Clara said without turning her head as they passed the hotel. Beatrice Hale was standing on her porch. She'd been standing there since Clara had sent word an hour before, and now the hotel keeper came down her steps in her good dress and crossed the street and fell into step on Clara's left, and made them three abreast, the widow, the barber, and the hotel keeper, walking down the middle of the road toward a wagon full of flour, and by now the whole street had stopped to watch. "You sure about this, girl?" Beatrice murmured. "No," Clara said. "But do it anyway." The land office door opened. Silas Crow came out onto the boardwalk, and he had 2 men with him, and one of them was the big man from the saloon, and the other was a lean man with a rifle held loose. And Crow stood at the top of the steps with his thumbs in his gun belt and watched the 3 of them come down the street toward his crate, and his good easy smile did not slip so much as an inch. "Evenin', Mrs. Whitmore," he called, pleasant as a Sunday. "Mrs. Hale, Otto." He nodded to each. "That's a fine little parade. Where might it be headed?" Clara stopped in the middle of the street 10 feet from the wagon, and Otto stopped on her right and Beatrice on her left, and the whole town watched. "To the Mercantile Sheriff," Clara said, and she pitched her voice to carry clear and even the way she'd pitched it in the saloon. "To collect a crate." "A crate?" Crow's smile widened. "Now what crate would that be?" "The one under the tarp on Henderson's wagon." Clara didn't look at the crate. She kept her eyes on Crow. "The one you packed yourself last night. The one with my husband's survey ledger in it, coffee stain on the spine bent corner, his initials carved in the cover. The one you're shipping to Denver at dusk to a man named Ambrose Vane at the Red Ash Mining Company on Larimer Street." The smile stopped widening. It was a small thing. Most of the street didn't catch it. But Clara caught it, and so did Caleb, from wherever he stood in the shadows. And so did Beatrice, whose hand found Clara's sleeve and gripped it. Silas Crow's smile stopped moving, and behind his eyes something cold and fast went to work. And Clara knew she'd just told him a thing he hadn't known. She knew the name Ambrose Vane, the address on Larimer Street, and she knew he was recalculating everything. "That's a wild story," Crow said, and his voice was still light, but the ease had gone out of it. "That's a grieving widow's story. There's no ledger. There's flour and feed on that wagon. Henderson's own load." "Then you won't mind if I look?" Clara took a step toward the wagon. "I mind considerable." Crow came down one step. The two men behind him shifted, and the lean one's rifle came up an inch. "That's private freight, ma'am. You lay a hand on Henderson's wagon that's theft, and I'm the law in this county, and I'll have to stop you." He smiled again, but it was a different smile now, a thinner one. "You wouldn't want that, not in front of all these good folks." And there it was. The threat dressed up as concern in front of the whole street. Exactly as she'd known it would come. Clara turned slowly, so that she was no longer facing the sheriff, but facing the street, facing the town. The 40 or 50 people who'd stopped their evening to watch the shopkeepers in their doorways, and the riders halted in their saddles, and the women with baskets on their arms, and the children peering from behind them. "You all heard him," she said, and her voice carried down the whole length of Main Street. "You heard the sheriff say there's nothing on that wagon but flour and feed. So there's an easy way to end this. I'm going to walk to that wagon, and I'm going to pull back that tarp, and if the sheriff's telling the truth, you'll all see flour and feed, and I'll be a foolish, grieving widow, and you can laugh me back to Denver on the morning stage." She turned her head and looked at Crow. "But if I pull back that tarp, and there's a pine crate under it, a crate the sheriff swore wasn't there, then every one of you is going to want to ask yourselves what else your sheriff's been swearing to." She looked back at the town. "That's all. That's the whole thing. Just a tarp and the truth under it." The street had gone dead silent. 50 people looked at the wagon. 50 people looked at the sheriff. And Silas Crow stood on his boardwalk step and felt the whole thing turning under him. Felt the town's eyes swinging like a weather vane, and Clara watched him feel it, and watched him understand the way she'd understood in the saloon, that he was in a trap with no good door. If he let her pull the tarp, the town saw the crate he'd sworn wasn't there. If he stopped her, if he sent his men to lay hands on a widow and a hotel keeper, and the town's beloved deaf barber in the middle of Main Street, at dusk the town saw that too. Saw their sheriff manhandle 3 of their own over a load of flour he swore was only flour. Either way, the tarp told the truth. "Otto," Clara said quietly without taking her eyes off Crow. "Tell them what you saw." And Otto Bell in his Sunday coat in the middle of Main Street turned to face the town he'd been furniture in for 30 years, and he spoke in that flat, overloud deaf man's voice that carried to every corner of the street. "I'm Otto Bell," he said. "I cut every man's hair in this town for 30 years, and every one of you talked over my head like I couldn't see what you was saying 'cause I can't hear. But I read lips. I read every lip in this town." His old voice cracked and rose. 2 years ago, Sheriff Silas Crow sat in my chair, and I read off his mouth in my own mirror. He said he had the Whitmore ledger locked in his office. And he said, Otto's voice broke, and he forced it on. He said, "This settles the widow problem. She'll take the fever story, or she'll join him under it." That's what I read off your sheriff's lips 2 years ago while he sat in my chair with my razor at his throat. And I've been too scared to say it. Till now. The street erupted in a low, horrified murmur. 50 voices at once, and Clara saw faces turn from the barber to the sheriff, saw the doubt bloom and spread, saw the exact thing she'd promised Caleb, a town beginning to remember itself. "And I'll tell you the rest," Beatrice Hale shouted, stepping forward beside Clara, her voice ringing off the storefronts. "My Ezra was your land clerk 11 years, and he wrote it all down before Crow killed him, that he was made to forge these records, that he was threatened, that the Whitmore claim was real, and this man erased it. I've got the letter in his own hand, and I'll read it to any judge that'll listen." "That's enough," Crow said, and now the ease was entirely gone, now there was iron in it. "Kavanaugh, get these people off the street." The big man came down off the boardwalk, and nobody moved to help him, and nobody moved to stop him either. And for one terrible moment, the whole thing hung in the balance, because a town that's been afraid for years doesn't lose its fear all at once. And Clara saw the townsfolk waver, saw them want to act and not know how, saw the old paralysis start to close over them again, like water over a stone. And into that terrible hanging moment, a voice called out from the crowd, "Leave her be, Kavanaugh." Heads turned. It was the barkeep from the Rusted Spur, the very man who'd set down his bottle so careful and quiet the night before while Clara bled on his floor, and he'd come out from behind his bar and into the street, and his hands were shaking, but his voice wasn't. "I watched him knock her down last night. I stood there and did nothing, and I ain't slept since. Leave her be." "Leave her be," said another voice, a woman, the mercantile owner's wife. "Leave her be," said the rancher near the front, and he stepped down off his horse to say it, and it moved through the crowd like fire through dry grass, the way Clara had prayed it would and hadn't dared believe it would. One voice, and then 5, and then 20, the whole street of Red Ash Crossing, finding all at once that they were not alone, that they had never been alone, that every one of them had been standing in the same fear and the same shame, and it only took one widow with a split lip to show them they could stand up together. Kavanaugh stopped in the middle of the street. He looked back at Crow. He looked at the 50 people closing ranks around the widow, and the big man, who was cruel but not a fool, did not take another step. "Sheriff," he said uncertainly. "Sheriff, this ain't—" "Pull the tarp, Clara," Beatrice said. And Clara Whitmore walked to Henderson's wagon through a town that had finally stood up, and she reached up and took hold of the tarp, and Silas Crow, on his boardwalk step, made the last calculation of his rain gun, or no gun crate, or no crate town, or no town, and found for the first time in 10 years that there was no number that added up in his favor. She pulled the tarp back, and there it sat in the long gold light in front of 50 witnesses, a plain pine crate, Red Ash Mining Company stenciled on the side. Denver below it, exactly where the sheriff had sworn there was nothing but flour. The street made a sound like a held breath let go. Clara pried up the loose lid. Reed had left it barely nailed. God bless him. One more small brave thing, and she reached into the packed papers, and her fingers closed on a spine. She'd have known blind in the dark, a spine with a coffee stain and a bent corner, and she drew out her husband's survey ledger and held it up over her head in the dying light for the whole town to see. "This is my husband's," she said, and her voice cracked at last, 2 years of it breaking loose all at once. "Daniel Whitmore. He filed an honest claim, and this man murdered him for it and erased his name from the earth. And here it is. Here's his hand. Here's his work. Here's the truth this man tried to ship to Denver and burn." She turned to Crow, and the tears were running down her bruised face, and she did not wipe them, and her voice rang out clear and terrible. "You said paper burns, Sheriff? You said it to me last night in the saloon. Well, here's your paper. Come and burn it. Come and take it out of my hands in front of your whole town." Silas Crow looked at the widow holding the ledger over her head, and the barber and the hotel keeper flanking her, and the 50 townsfolk standing between him and her with their faces set, and the big man Kavanaugh frozen useless in the middle of the street, and he understood at last completely that he had lost. So he did the only thing a cornered man like Silas Crow has left. He went for his gun. It came out fast and clean and murderous, the polished sheriff's gun leaping into his hand, the muzzle swinging up toward the widow and the ledger and the truth. And Clara didn't get down. Couldn't get down, was frozen with 2 years of grief, and the book held high over her head, and a single shot cracked across Main Street from the shadow of the alley beside the mercantile. Crow's gun spun out of his hand. The sheriff cried out and clutched his wrist, and his gun clattered into the dust 10 feet away, and Caleb Mercer walked out of the shadow with his own revolver leveled and smoke curling from the barrel, and his voice came flat and cold and carrying across the silent street. "Caleb Mercer," he said, "Deputy United States Marshal on assignment out of the Denver Federal Court, these 6 weeks past, under Judge Harrison Vale's own seal." He let that land on the stunned street, on the stunned sheriff, on the widow who'd never once suspected the outlaw was the law. "Silas Crow, you're under federal arrest for the murder of Daniel Whitmore, the murder of Isaac Whitmore, the murder of Ezra Hale, and the theft of registered claims and conspiracy with the Red Ash Mining Company." He advanced gun steady, and no man in that street moved to help the sheriff, not one. You so much as breathe wrong, and I will finish what I started, and there's 50 witnesses here who'll swear it was clean." He tilted his head. "Now, where's Deputy Reed? And he'd best be breathing crow because a federal judge is riding into this town tomorrow. And how you answer that question is the difference between a Denver cell and a Denver rope." Silas Crow knelt in the dust of the street he'd owned for 10 years, clutching his ruined wrist, staring up at the marshal he'd been drinking beside for 6 weeks, and the good, easy smile was gone from his face forever. And from the direction of the land office, a door banged open, and a voice croaked out, weak and ragged, into the evening. "I'm here." Thomas Reed staggered out onto the boardwalk, bloodied and beaten and barely upright, one eye swollen shut, holding himself against the doorframe, but alive and grinning through split lips at the widow in the street, holding her husband's ledger over her head. "I'm here, ma'am. I marked the book. I told you I'd mark the book." He slid down the doorframe to sit on the boards, laughing and weeping at once. "I looked at it straight. Tell my daddy." I finally looked at it straight. And Clara Whitmore stood in the middle of Main Street with her husband's truth held high over her head, and the whole town of Red Ash Crossing standing at her back, and for the first time in 2 years, in the long gold light of the dying day, she let herself weep for everything she had carried, and everything she had lost, and everything at last, at terrible last, she had won. They locked Silas Crow in his own jail that night, and there was a strange justice in the sound of his own key turning in his own lock. And Caleb Mercer stood outside the cell a long moment, looking in at the man he'd hunted for 2 years before he said anything at all. 6 weeks I drank beside you," Caleb said finally. 6 weeks I called you friend and let you buy me whiskey. You want to know the hardest part of this whole job? It weren't finding the proof. It was smiling at you every night, knowing what you did to Isaac." Crow sat on the cell cot, cradling his bandaged wrist, and he looked up. And even now, even here, the ghost of the old easy smile flickered across his face. "You think you've won, Marshal?" His voice was soft. "You think a widow with a book and a deaf man with a story and a broke deputy is going to stand up in front of a circuit judge and bring down Ambrose Vane, the governor's own kin?" He shook his head slowly. "You've got no idea what you've stepped in. That ledger don't hang me. That ledger's a rope with no beam to throw it over because every beam in this territory belongs to the company." The smile widened. "Judge Vale rides in tomorrow, and he takes one look at whose name is in that crate, and he does what every honest man in this territory has learned to do. He looks the other way, because the men who'd have to enforce his order all work for me." He leaned back against the wall. "You didn't catch a fish tonight, Mercer. You just showed the whole pond where you're standing." Caleb didn't answer. He turned and walked out, and Clara was waiting in the office with the ledger clutched to her chest, and she'd heard every word. "Is he right?" she asked quietly. "He might be," Caleb said. There was no point lying to her. She'd have caught it. A judge can sign whatever order he pleases, Clara, but an order's just more paper if there's no honest lawman in the whole territory to serve it. And Crow's not wrong that the company owns most of them. He rubbed his face, and for the first time she saw how tired he was, 2 years of it sitting on him at once. "We got the truth tonight. Getting the truth to matter, that's a different fight, and it starts when that judge rides in tomorrow, and I won't lie to you and say I know how it ends." Jean Mimane. Clara looked down at the ledger. "Then we don't just hand the judge a book," she said slowly. "A book he can look away from." She lifted her head. "We hand him a book he can't look away from. We hand him so much truth from so many mouths in front of so many witnesses that looking away costs him more than doing right. We do to the judge what I did to the town." Her jaw set. "We make it so the whole territory is watching, and the only way out is through. And how do we make the whole territory watch? The same way I made the town watch." She almost smiled. "We give them something they can't stop looking at." She spent that whole night at Beatrice Hale's kitchen table, and she did not sleep, and she did what a woman who'd kept 11 years of a surveyor's books did best. She built a case the way she'd have built a ledger, every entry in its place, every figure cross-checked, every claim tied to its proof. She laid Daniel's filing receipt beside the false company claim, and showed where the section numbers matched exact the same land, the same coordinates, one honest and one forged. She laid Ezra Hale's confession beside the altered land book and showed the forger's own words admitting the forgery. She wrote down in her clean bookkeeper's hand every single thing Otto Bell had read off Crow's lips, dated and detailed. And she made Thomas Reed, swollen-eyed and shaking, sit across from her and tell her everything. Every paper he'd signed, every body he'd seen, every lie he'd entered in the official record, and she wrote it all down and had him sign each page while Beatrice witnessed it. By the time the sun came up, Clara Whitmore had turned a crate of stolen papers into a case. But she wasn't finished. "Beatrice," she said as the gray light came into the kitchen. "Last night on Main Street the barkeep spoke up. The mercantile woman. The rancher. 50 of them in the end." She set down her pen. "They watched Crow hit me in the saloon and did nothing because they thought they were alone. Then they found out they weren't and they stood up." Her eyes were steady. "I need them to stand up one more time, in front of the judge. I need every one of those 50 people to come to that hearing and fill that room, so that when Harrison Vale decides whether to look away or not, he's deciding in front of the whole town that finally stopped being afraid." Beatrice Hale looked at her a long moment. "You want a courtroom full of witnesses the judge has to answer to." "I want a courtroom so full," Clara said, "that looking away isn't a quiet thing a man does in private. I want it to be a thing he does in front of everyone, because a man'll do in private what he'd be ashamed to do in the light." She stood. "Go wake the town, Beatrice. Tell them the widow's hearing is this morning. Tell them Otto Bell's going to speak. Tell them the deputy's going to confess. And tell them—" her voice caught. "Tell them that last night they remembered how to stand up, and this morning they get to finish it." Judge Harrison Vale rode into Red Ash Crossing at 9 o'clock in the morning, and he was an old man, thin and stooped, with white hair and a face like weathered granite, and eyes that had seen 40 years of men lying to them and had stopped being surprised by any of it. He'd meant to spend the morning clearing a docket of cattle disputes and a drunken disorderly. Instead, he found the town's only meeting room, the long room off Hale House, where Beatrice held church socials packed wall to wall with half the population of the county, and a widow with a fading bruise standing at the front beside a crate of papers, and his own deputy marshal, whom he had personally dispatched to this territory under seal 6 weeks before, standing at her right hand. "Somebody," Judge Vale said dryly, hanging his hat by the door, "had best explain to me why my morning docket has turned into a revival meeting." "Your Honor." Caleb stepped forward. "Deputy Marshal Mercer, you sent me here to find the loose thread in the Red Ash claims. I found the whole rope, and this woman," he nodded to Clara, "pulled it." The old judge's eyes sharpened. He looked at Clara. He looked at the crate. He looked at the room full of townsfolk silent and watching, and something in the set of the crowd told him this was no ordinary morning. "Sit down, all of you," he said, and lowered himself into the chair Beatrice had set at the head table. "Marshal, you'll administer oaths." "Ma'am," to Clara. "You seem to be the one holding the papers, so you'll start. And I'll tell you plain before you say a word, I've had claims cases before me for 40 years, and 9 times in 10, they're a grieving soul who's convinced the world of a thing that ain't so. So don't tell me what you believe. Show me what you can prove." He folded his hands. "Begin." Well, and Clara Whitmore began. She did not weep, and she did not plead, and she did not tell him what she believed. She stood at the head of that packed room, and she opened her husband's ledger, and she laid out the case she'd built through the night, entry by entry, proof by proof, in the clean, cold voice of a woman reading a column of figures. Daniel Whitmore filed a silver claim on Section 19 of the North Ridge on the 14th of October, 1881, she said, and held up the filing receipt. "Here is the receipt in the hand of the land clerk, Ezra Hale, stamped and dated. Here is the fee paid in full." She set it down and picked up a second paper. "Here is the claim that stands in the land office book today. Red Ash Mining Company. Same section, same coordinates, same land. I've checked the numbers 3 times and they match to the rod." She held them side by side so the judge could see. "2 claims on 1 piece of ground, Your Honor. 1 filed by my husband and vanished. one filed by a company and standing. The question before you is which is real, and I can prove which is real because the man who forged the false one wrote down that he forged it. She laid Ezra Hale's letter on the table in front of the judge. Judge Vale read it in silence. The whole room watched him read it. And Clara watched his granite face and saw the exact moment his eyes reached the part where Ezra Hale confessed he'd been forced to forge the records by a threat against his wife, and saw the old judge's jaw tighten by a fraction. "This is a dead man's letter," Vale said, but his voice had changed. "A dead man can't be cross-examined." "No, Your Honor, but a living one can." Clara turned. "Otto Bell." And Otto Bell rose in his Sunday coat, and Caleb swore him in, and the old deaf barber told the judge what he'd told the town, that he'd read the words off Crow's own lips in his own mirror, that the sheriff had bragged the ledger was locked in his office, that he'd said this settles the widow problem, she'll take the fever story, or she'll join him under it. And when Judge Vale, careful testing, asked how a deaf man could be sure of words he never heard, Otto looked the judge dead in the eye and said, "Your Honor, I've been readin' lips 60 years. I read yours just now plain as print. You asked how a deaf man could be sure." And a low sound went through the room, half gasp and half something like awe, and even the old judge sat back a little. But Clara wasn't finished. "Your Honor," she said, "a forged record and a Reed confession. That's 2 threads. Here's the 3rd. She turned again. "Deputy Thomas Reed." And the room went still because everyone knew Reed was Crow's man. Everyone had seen him stand in doorways for 2 years, and now here he came, swollen-eyed and limping, to stand in front of the judge, and nobody knew what he'd say. Reed was sworn. His voice shook. "My name's Thomas Reed," he said. "I've been Silas Crow's deputy since I was 19, and I'm here to tell you every rotten thing I done because I'd rather hang honest than live a liar one more day." He gripped the table to steady himself. "I signed false records. I entered lies in the official book. When Isaac Whitmore was murdered in the land office 2 years back, I wrote in the log that he died fallen off his horse, and I knew it weren't true, and I signed my name to it." His voice broke. "And when this lady's husband's brother was carried out under a tarp, I helped carry him, and I helped bury him in a hole with no stone, and I've knowed where that hole is for 2 years. Your Honor, and I'll take any man to it that wants to dig." The room erupted. Judge Vale banged his hand on the table for quiet, but even he had leaned forward now, and Clara saw the old man's 40 years of caution cracking open in front of her. "You're confessing to being an accessory to murder, Deputy," Vale said. "You understand you're hanging yourself with every word." "I understand it fine, Your Honor." Reed straightened as best he could. "My daddy was a preacher. He said a man gets one chance to be brave. I looked away from mine for 2 years. He met the judge's eyes. "I ain't looking away no more." And that was the moment. Clara felt it turn. Felt the whole room turn. A dead man's letter could be dismissed, and a deaf man's testimony could be doubted, but a living deputy hanging himself with his own confession, that was a thing no honest judge could look away from. And Harrison Vale was under all his weary granite an honest judge. But Silas Crow had promised her the beam belonged to the company, and Silas Crow was about to be proven right, because it was at that exact moment, with Reed's confession still hanging in the air, with the judge leaning forward with the whole case built and balanced and ready to fall the right way, that the door at the back of the room banged open, and a man walked in. And he was dressed too fine for Red Ash Crossing, in a gray suit of city broadcloth with a gold watch chain and soft, clean hands, and the unhurried confidence of a man who had never in his life been told no. "Your Honor," the man said, and his voice was smooth and carrying and utterly certain. "I do apologize for the interruption. My name is Ambrose Vane. I'm president of the Red Ash Mining Company." He came up the center aisle through the parting crowd, and he was smiling, and it was Crow's smile grown rich and citified. "And I'm afraid this poor woman has been terribly, terribly misled." The room went cold and silent. Clara felt her stomach drop. Ambrose Vane, here, in person. The governor's own brother-in-law, the top of the ladder. The man the crate was meant for, and Caleb had said he was in Denver. Caleb had said they had days, and here he stood in the flesh, which meant somebody had ridden hard through the night to fetch him, which meant Crow had gotten word out before they locked him up, which meant he was ready for us, she breathed to Caleb. He had a rider, he knew. Steady, Caleb murmured. But his hand had drifted toward his coat. Ambrose Vane reached the front of the room and turned to face the judge with the ease of a man who owned every courtroom he'd ever entered. "Harrison," he said warmly, and the use of the judge's Christian name landed on the room like a slap. "How long has it been, the Fairfield hearing? I trust Margaret's well." He smiled. "Your Honor, I'll make this simple because I know your time is valuable, and this town has clearly worked itself into a lather over a misunderstanding. The Red Ash Mining Company holds legal registered title to Section 19. It's been ours 2 years. Whatever documents this widow has produced, whatever stories these poor frightened people have been frightened into telling, the fact remains that the law recognizes registered title, and our title is registered and stands." He spread his soft, clean hands. "I'm sure Sheriff Crow overstepped. I'm sure there's been rough handling. I'll want to look into personally. But the claim is ours, Your Honor, and I'd hate to see a distinguished judge's docket muddied by a grief-stricken woman and a confessed criminal deputy who'll say anything to save his own neck." He turned and looked at Clara for the first time, and his eyes were flat and cold and pitiless as a closed ledger. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. Truly. But sorrow isn't title." And Clara Whitmore understood in that moment exactly what Crow had meant. The beam belonged to the company. Here was the company standing in the flesh, invoking registered title and the judge's Christian name and the governor's shadow behind him. And she watched Harrison Vale's face and saw the old caution come back over it, saw 40 years of learning, which fights a judge in this territory could not win, and she felt the whole thing she'd built through the night begin to slide toward the dark. She had one card left. She'd been saving it. She hadn't even shown Caleb. Through the long night, going through the crate paper by paper, she'd found one thing she hadn't understood. A thing that hadn't fit the case she was building. And she'd set it aside and puzzled at it. And near dawn, she'd finally understood what it was. And she'd decided to hold it until she knew whether she'd need it. She needed it now. "Mr. Vane," Clara said quietly. The room turned to her. "You say your title's been registered 2 years, legal and proper." She reached into her satchel. "Then I've got a question about your own company's books. Because your sheriff didn't just pack my husband's ledger into that crate, Mr. Vane. He packed everything from his safe. Everything he thought was going to Denver to be filed away, safe with you." She drew out a single folded paper, including this. Your company's own internal ledger of payments, in your own bookkeeper's hand. Not forged, not stolen, yours. Ambrose Vane's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes did. "I don't know what you think you have. I think I have your company's payment record," Clara said, and her bookkeeper's voice was rising now, clear and certain. "And I've spent 11 years reading ledgers. Mr. Vane and I read this one all night. It's a list of payments from the Red Ash Mining Company, monthly, to named men, and I recognized some of the names." She held it up. "There's a payment to Silas Crow, $200 a month marked County Administration. There's a payment to a Denver assayer marked Valuation Adjustment. And there's a payment, Your Honor." She turned to Judge Vale, and her voice rang out, "of $500 a month every month for 2 years to a man named on this page only as H.V. Circuit." The room went so silent, Clara could hear the old judge breathing. "H.V.," Clara said softly. "Circuit. A circuit judge. Your Honor initials H.V., receiving $500 a month from the Red Ash Mining Company." She set the paper down on the table in front of Harrison Vale, face up where he and the whole front of the room could read it. "Now I'll tell you what I believe, Judge, and then I'll show you why I believe you're an honest man despite it. I believe Ambrose Vane has been paying a circuit judge to look the other way for 2 years. And I believe he walked in here just now certain you were that judge. certain that the minute he said your Christian name and mentioned the governor, you'd fold the way you always fold, the way he's paid you to fold. She held his eyes. But I looked at the dates on this ledger, Your Honor. Every payment's marked received and initialed by the bookkeeper. Except I checked them against the court calendar Beatrice keeps for the socials, and 3 of these payments are dated for weeks when Harrison Vale wasn't riding this circuit at all. He was 200 miles south in the Fairfield district, which means the HV taking Ambrose Vane's money. Her voice cracked with the force of it. Isn't you. It's the man who rides this circuit in the off-season. Your substitute, Judge Horace Vine, HV. And Ambrose Vane just walked into this room and mistook the honest judge for the crooked one, because to a man like him, Your Honor, every judge is the same judge. Every one of them bought, every one of them for sale, and he never once imagined there might be one left he couldn't buy. Ambrose Vane had gone white. Harrison Vale sat perfectly still, looking down at the ledger, at the initials, at the dates, and the whole room held its breath, and Clara watched 40 years of weary caution war with 40 years of buried insulted honor in the old man's granite face. Horace Vine, Judge Vale said at last, very quietly. He rides my circuit when I'm south. He looked up, and his eyes had gone terrible. He sat at my own table 2 months ago and complained he couldn't make ends meet on a judge's pay. He picked up the ledger with the initials in it, and his hand was not quite steady. $500 a month. He looked at Ambrose Vane. You walked into my courtroom, sir, and called me by my Christian name and reminded me of the governor, and you did it because you were certain I was a thing you'd bought. His voice dropped, and it shook with a cold old fury. You mistook me for a man you owned. There is no insult in 40 years on the bench that I have felt more keenly than that one. Harrison, Vane started, you will address me as Your Honor. Vale rose to his feet, all his stoop gone out of him, and he was suddenly not a tired old man at all, but the last honest law in a bought territory, and his voice filled the room. Deputy Marshal Mercer, arrest that man. He pointed at Ambrose Vane. On charges of bribery of a judicial officer, conspiracy to commit fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder, pending the fuller investigation that this ledger and these witnesses plainly demand. And send a rider to Denver for the territorial attorney and another for the federal court, because before I am done in this county, I intend to know the name of every man on this list up to and including. His jaw set, whatever family it touches. I don't care whose brother-in-law he is. The room exploded. Caleb crossed the floor in 3 strides and had Ambrose Vane's soft, clean hands cuffed behind his back before the man fully understood what was happening. And Vane was shouting about lawyers and the governor and territorial politics, and nobody in that packed room of Red Ash Crossing was listening to a word of it because they were all on their feet. All 50 of them, the barkeep and the mercantile woman and the rancher and the rest, cheering and weeping and pounding each other's backs, a whole town that had been silent for 2 years, finding its voice all at once and using it. And through it all, Clara Whitmore stood at the head table, one hand flat on her husband's ledger, and did not cheer and did not weep, not yet. She watched Judge Harrison Vale pull a sheet of paper toward himself and dip a pen, and she watched his hand move across the page, and she knew what he was writing before he said it. Let the record show, Vale said, and the room fell quiet to hear him, that the claim on Section 19 filed by Daniel Whitmore on the 14th of October, 1881, is hereby recognized as valid, original, and lawful, and all subsequent claims upon that ground are struck void as fraudulent. He signed his name. He blotted it. The silver claim and all rights and profits pertaining thereto are restored in full to the surviving spouse and lawful heir. He looked up. Mrs. Clara Whitmore. And there it was. Not a speech, not a gunshot, not a scream of triumph. Just an old man's pen moving across a page the same small ordinary act by which Ezra Hale had once been forced to bury the truth, running now finally at last in the right direction. Clara Whitmore watched a legal pen sign her husband's name back onto the earth it belonged to, and after 2 years of watching official ink lie about everything she loved, the sight of it, telling one single true thing, broke her completely. She put her face in her hands, and she wept, and Beatrice Hale's arm came around her shoulders, and Otto Bell stood beside her in his Sunday coat, with tears running down his ancient face. And Thomas Reed sat with his swollen eyes shining, a confessed criminal who'd hang or not hang, but who had for one morning been brave. And Caleb Mercer stood across the room with a cuffed millionaire in his grip, and looked at the widow he'd found bleeding on a saloon floor 2 nights before. And something in his hard, tired face had come open that had been closed for a very long time. Later, after the room had emptied, after Ambrose Vane had been locked in the cell beside his own bought sheriff after the riders had gone galloping for Denver, Judge Harrison Vale found Clara alone at the head table, still holding the ledger, unable quite to set it down. "That was the finest piece of bookkeeping I ever saw in a courtroom, Mrs. Whitmore," the old judge said. 40 years and I never saw a case built cleaner. You checked the payment dates against a church social calendar." He shook his head slowly. "A whole territory's worth of lawyers couldn't have caught what you caught." "I'm not a lawyer, Your Honor." Clara wiped her face. "I'm just a woman who kept her husband's books, and I learned a long time ago that the numbers don't lie even when every man in the room is lying. You just have to be willing to read them all night." She finally set the ledger down on the table. Crow told Caleb the beam belonged to the company, that an honest judge couldn't do anything because the men who'd enforce his order all worked for the men he'd be ruling against. She looked up. "Was he right? Now that you've signed it, can you make it hold?" Judge Harrison Vale was quiet a moment. 2 days ago," he said, "he'd have been right. An honest judge alone in a bought territory can sign all the orders he likes and watch them die unserved." He picked up the payment ledger, the one with Horace Vine's initials, the one that reached up toward the governor's own family. "But he didn't count on you handing me the one thing that changes it. This isn't a claims dispute anymore, Mrs. Whitmore. It's a corruption case that runs to the governor's household, and that's not a thing a territory buries. That's a thing that brings federal men and newspapers and a reckoning too big for any company to swallow." He tucked the ledger into his coat against his heart. "You didn't just win your husband's claim back. You handed the honest men of this territory the crowbar we've needed for years." He put on his hat. "Crow goes to Denver for federal trial. So does Vane. And I mean to see this list followed to the very top, so help me God." He paused at the door. "Get some rest, ma'am. You've earned it. And Mrs. Whitmore," he tipped his hat, "your husband would be proud. Any man would." And Clara Whitmore sat alone in the empty meeting room with her husband's ledger in front of her and the long light coming through the windows, and she did not feel triumphant, and she did not feel finished. She felt for the first time in 2 years simply quiet, the deep bone quiet of a burden finally truly set down. 2 years she'd carried Daniel's murdered truth alone, and now it lived in a judge's coat and a town's memory and a court's record, and it would never again be a thing she had to hold up by herself in the dark. She ran her fingers over the initials her husband had carved into the cover of the ledger, the D and the W. 2 small letters a living man had cut into leather, never knowing they'd one day be the thing that brought an empire down. "I found it, Daniel," she whispered. "I found it, and I brought it home, and I made them look at it. All of them." Her fingers pressed the carved letters. "They can't ever say you didn't do it right. Not anymore. Not ever again." Outside the town of Red Ash Crossing was still celebrating in the streets. And somewhere in the crowd an outlaw who was really a marshal was watching the door of the meeting room, waiting for a widow to be ready to come out into a world that had at last been set to rights. She came out into the celebrating street eventually, because Beatrice came and got her, and the town of Red Ash Crossing did a thing that afternoon that Clara Whitmore would carry to the end of her days. They lined up to apologize, not all at once and not easily. The barkeep from the Rusted Spur came first, twisting his hat the way Reed had twisted his, and he stood in front of her a long moment before he could get the words out. "I set my bottle down," he said. "That night, when he knocked you down, I set my bottle down real quiet so I wouldn't have to look at you, and I told myself it weren't my business." His voice cracked. "It was my business, ma'am. It was every man's business in that room, and we all set our bottles down. I'm sorry. It ain't near enough, but I'm sorry. You spoke up on Main Street, Clara said. When it counted, you spoke up first. Only 'cause you showed me I could. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, ashamed and unashamed both. Only 'cause you got up. You had no cause to get up, and you got up anyway. And behind him came the mercantile woman and the rancher, and one after another the men and women who'd watched her fall, and Clara stood in the street and let each of them say their piece, and she did not make it easy for them, and she did not make it hard. She just let them be seen doing the thing they'd been too afraid to do, and something healed in the town as they did it. Not all the way, not clean, but the way a bone heals knitting back stronger at the break. Caleb watched from the edge of it, and when the line finally thinned, he came to stand beside her. You could have made 'em grovel, he said. After what they did, you'd have had the right. No. Clara watched the last of them walk back to their ordinary evening. A town that grovels is still afraid. I don't want them afraid. I want them upright. She turned to him. Fear is what Crow used. I'm not going to build anything on the same rotten foundation he did. Caleb looked at her a long moment. Build, he repeated. You said build. I did. Clara. He glanced at her sideways. The claim's yours now. Section 19. That's a rich vein by your husband's own survey. You could sell it tomorrow to any mining outfit in Denver for more money than you'd spend in 3 lifetimes, and never see this hard country again. He said it carefully, watching her. Most folks would. Take the money and go somewhere the streets are paved, and nobody ever knocked you down. Clara was quiet for a moment. Come with me tomorrow, she said. Up to the ridge. There's something I want you to see before you say another word about selling. They rode up to the North Ridge in the morning, the two of them up to the red Colorado earth, where Daniel Whitmore had first driven his surveyor's stake into the ground and found silver, running through the rock like a secret the mountain had been keeping. And Clara sat her horse a long time at the top and looked out over the land her husband had died for, and Caleb waited because he'd learned by now that when Clara Whitmore went quiet, she was building something, and it was worth the wait to see what. Daniel used to write me letters from out here, she said finally, before he sent for me. He'd describe this ridge like a man describing a woman he'd fallen in love with. She almost smiled. But it wasn't the silver he loved. He hardly mentioned the silver. He wrote about the men working the claims around him, smallholders, families, a widow 2 ridges over trying to work her dead husband's stake alone with 3 children. He wrote that this country ate people like her alive because the law out here belonged to whoever could afford it, and folks like that widow couldn't afford anything. Clara's jaw tightened. That's what got him killed, you know, not the silver. Crow would have let him keep the silver if he'd shut up and paid his cut. Daniel got killed because he started helping the smallholders file their claims proper, showing them how to protect their paper. And a territory full of smallholders who know how to protect their paper is the one thing a company like Red Ash can't steal from. She looked at Caleb. He was building something out here, and they murdered him to stop it. And then they erased him so completely that even I believed the fever story for a while. And now I'm going to finish it. She swung down off her horse and walked to the surveyor's stake, weathered gray still standing where Daniel had driven it 2 years before. She knelt and put her hand on it. I'm not selling, Caleb. I'm going to open this mine legal, and I'm going to work it, and I'm going to pay fair wages instead of company wages, and I'm going to hire the men who lost their own claims to Crow and Vane, and give them honest work while the courts sort out their land. She stood and she pulled from her satchel a folded paper and a pencil, and Caleb saw it was the beginning of a document written in her clean bookkeeper's hand. And I'm going to take a piece of every dollar this Vane brings up, and I'm going to build a fund. A widows and smallholders fund. To pay for a proper land lawyer that folks like that woman with 3 children can use for free. So the next time a company sends a polished man in a gray suit to steal an honest family's ground, they won't be standing there alone with nothing but grief and a stolen receipt. Her voice was steady and certain. They'll have papers, And they'll have a lawyer. And they'll have a whole territory's worth of people who learned in Red Ash Crossing that you can stand up to these men and win if you keep your books clean and you refuse to be afraid." Caleb Mercer looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked out over the ridge, and when he spoke, his voice was rough. "Whitmore Silver Works," he said quietly. Clara turned. "What?" "That night, outside the saloon. You asked me why I was helping you, and I said a thing I'd tell you about someday." He almost smiled. "I said Whitmore Silver Works under my breath, and you asked what I meant, and I said it was a thing for someday." He nodded at the stake at the ridge at the beginning of a document in her hand. "This is what I meant. I looked at you standing in that saloon with blood on your face, refusing to stay down, and something in me, some old dead part I thought Crow had killed along with Isaac. It looked at you and thought that one's not gonna just get her claim back. That one's gonna build something." He shook his head slowly. "I didn't half believe it. 2 years of watching this territory grind good people to dust, I didn't believe anybody built anymore. They only survived or they didn't." He met her eyes. "But here you are, buildin'." "Here I am," Clara said softly. They put the sign up 3 weeks later. It was Otto Bell who painted it because it turned out the old barber had a steady hand and a good eye, and he wouldn't let anyone else do it. Whitmore Silver Works. In clean black letters, and beneath it smaller in Clara's own words, "Honest ground, honest wage, honest books." And the whole town came up the ridge to see it raised, because by then the whole town had a stake in it. Half of them had gone to work for her, and the other half had loaned tools, or hauled timber, or brought food, and Red Ash Crossing had discovered that a town which stands up together stays standing together, and there is a kind of prosperity in that no company wage ever bought. Beatrice Hale ran the payroll office because a hotel keeper who'd survived widowhood in that country could count money and read a man's character both at a glance, and Clara trusted her with the books second only to herself. Thomas Reed, who did not hang in the end because Judge Vale wrote to the federal court that a man who confessed everything unbidden and turned state's evidence against a governor's family had earned his mercy, and the court agreed. Thomas Reed worked the mine as an ordinary hand and slept nights for the first time in years, and wrote a letter to his preacher daddy that Clara helped him with, and got one back that he carried in his shirt pocket until the paper wore soft. And Otto Bell, who was too old to swing a pick, sat in a chair by the mine office where the men came to talk to him at the end of a shift, and he read their lips and gave his opinions too loud, and for the first time in 30 years, he was not furniture in anybody's town. He was the man who'd stood up on Main Street. Everybody knew it. Everybody made sure he knew they knew. The trials came that autumn in Denver, and they were exactly the reckoning Judge Harrison Vale had promised. Silas Crow went first, and Clara rode to Denver to watch it. And she sat in the gallery, with the survey ledger in her lap, while a federal prosecutor laid out 2 years of murder and theft in front of 12 men. And Otto Bell testified, and Thomas Reed testified, and Clara herself testified, reading the ledgers aloud in her clean, cold voice until the whole courtroom understood exactly how the numbers had lied, and exactly how she'd caught them out. Crow sat through all of it with his bandaged wrist and his ruined smile, and when the verdict came, he did not smile at all. He was sentenced to hang for the murders of Daniel Whitmore, Isaac Whitmore, and Ezra Hale, and Ambrose Vane, the polished man, the governor's brother-in-law, the top of the ladder. Crow had sworn no widow could ever reach Ambrose Vane's trial, brought the newspapers Vale had promised, and the newspapers brought the whole rotten scheme into the light, and the payment ledger in the honest judge's coat became exactly as he'd said. The crowbar that pried open a corruption running to the governor's own household. The governor resigned before the year was out. Judge Horace Vine H.V. Circuit was disbarred and indicted. And the Red Ash Mining Company, which had murdered honest men up and down the territory and buried them without stones, was broken up by a federal court, and its stolen claims returned one by one to the widows and small holders. It had robbed many of them, helped through the process, free of charge by a land lawyer, paid out of a fund that a woman had built with silver from Section 19. Caleb Mercer had to go back to Denver, of course. He was still a deputy marshal, still had a badge and a duty and a territory that needed honest law more than ever, with the company broken and the governor gone and everything to rebuild. He came to tell Clara the morning he was to ride out, and he found her at the mine office going over the payroll with Beatrice, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and waited for her to look up. She looked up. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. "Denver wants me. There's 40 more crows in this territory now that the top's come off. Somebody's got to go pull the rest of the threads." He turned his hat in his hands. "It's the work, Clara. It's the work I came out here to do, and it ain't finished, and I'm the man to do it." "I know." And she did know. She'd known since the Ridge. A woman who'd loved a man who died for his work knew better than most that you didn't ask such a man to set it down. "When do you ride?" "Within the hour." Clara set down her pen. "Beatrice." Wise old Beatrice murmured something about checking on the kitchen and made herself scarce, and then it was just the two of them in the little office, with the autumn light coming through the window, and a great many things unsaid between them. "I'm not going to ask you to stay," Clara said. "I know you ain't. That's half of why I—" He stopped, started over rougher. "You could ask is the thing. You've got the right to ask. After all of it. Most women would ask. Would you stay if I did?" Caleb was quiet a long moment. "No," he said honestly. "Not because I wouldn't want to. Because I'd hate myself for it, and a man who hates himself ain't worth staying for. And because," he looked at her, really looked at her, "because you didn't fight your way up off that saloon floor and build all this to become a woman who needs a man to stay. You'd never forgive me for letting you shrink back down to that. And I'd never forgive myself." He shook his head. "You're the least needful woman I ever met, Clara Whitmore. It's the finest thing about you, and it's the reason I can't let you talk me into ruining us both." Clara felt her throat tighten. "So this is goodbye," she said. "No." Caleb crossed the room then, and he took her hand, and his rough gun hand was gentle around her fingers. "This ain't goodbye. Goodbye's for people who ain't comin' back." He looked down at their joined hands. "I've got a territory to clean up. Could take a year. Could take 2. And when it's done, when there's honest law from Denver to the border, and I've pulled the last thread and I don't have to wear another man's name to do my job, I'm gonna ride back up this ridge, and I'm gonna find out if a woman who builds things has got room in what she's built for a tired old marshal who finally ran out of outlaws to chase." He lifted his eyes. "I ain't asking you to wait. A woman like you shouldn't wait for any man. I'm just telling you where I'll be pointed when the work lets me point somewhere. And if I've built something by then that doesn't have room, then I'll tip my hat," Caleb said steadily. "And I'll be glad I knew you. And I'll ride on knowing the West is a better place for having Clara Whitmore standing upright in the middle of it." His mouth twitched. "But I don't reckon that's how it'll go." "No." "No, ma'am." And there it was, the real smile, the slow, surprised one that cut through all the road dust and the hard years. "'Cause I've seen your books. And a woman who keeps her ledgers as careful as you do, who never once leaves an honest debt unsettled." He pressed her hand. "A woman like that don't forget a man who stood up for her when the whole world was looking the other way. She squares that account someday. I'd bet the claim on it." Clara laughed, and it was wet, and she didn't care. "You'd bet my claim on it. I'd bet my life on it. Already did more'n once." He let go of her hand slow, and stepped back, and settled his hat on his head, and touched the brim to her the way he had that first night outside the saloon, the way a man does to something he's decided to respect. "You take care of this town, Clara Whitmore, and this town'll take care of you till I get back." He turned in the doorway. He turned in. And when folks ask you how a widow with a split lip brought down the whole Red Ash Mining Company and half the territorial government with nothing but a book of figures and a refusal to stay down, he grinned. "You tell 'em the truth. You tell 'em you did it your own self, every bit of it. All I ever did was fire one shot and get out of your way." Becky died. And Caleb Mercer walked out into the autumn morning, and swung up onto his horse and rode down off the ridge toward Denver and the long, hard work of setting a territory right. And Clara Whitmore stood in the doorway of the mine her husband had died for and watched him go. And she did not cry, and she did not call him back because she understood him and he understood her. And some accounts are the kind you're content to leave open, knowing they'll be squared in time. She went back inside. Beatrice was waiting by the payroll book, one eyebrow raised, and Clara sat down and picked up her pen without a word, and the two women went back to the honest work of counting an honest wage for honest men. And if Clara's eyes were bright, it was nobody's business but her own. That winter, a woman came up the ridge. She was thin and worn, with 3 children trailing behind her, and a dead man's stolen receipt clutched in her chapped hand. And she'd walked 2 ridges over on the strength of a rumor that there was a woman up at Whitmore Silver Works who helped folks the company had robbed, who paid for a lawyer out of her own pocket, who'd stood up to the whole rotten scheme and won. She stood in the mine office, twisting her receipt, the way Reed had twisted his hat, the way the barkeep had twisted his, the particular gesture of a frightened person about to ask for help they don't believe they'll get. They told me. The woman said, there was a Mrs. Whitmore up here who might. That is, my husband filed a claim before he passed legal and proper, and the company says it was never. They say I've got no. Her voice broke. They say sorrow ain't title. That's what the man in the gray suit told me. Sorrow ain't title. And Clara Whitmore rose from her desk and came around it and took the woman's chapped hands in both of hers, exactly the way Beatrice Hale had taken hers on a midnight 2 years before. And she looked into the frightened face of a widow who thought she was alone the way every robbed and beaten soul in that country had been taught to think they were alone. He's wrong, Clara said. Sorrow isn't title, but a receipt is, and a witness is, and a clean set of books is. She drew the woman toward the desk, toward the ledgers, toward the fund, and the lawyer, and the whole machinery a murdered man had dreamed of, and a widow had built. Sit down. Let me see that receipt. And dry your eyes, because you're not alone anymore, and you're not going to lose. Not here. Not while I keep the books in this territory. She sat the woman down and pulled the ledger toward her and dipped her pen, and it moved across the page in the right direction, the way it would move 1,000 more times in the years to come. Now, tell me his name. Tell me your husband's name, and where he filed, and we'll start there. We always start with the name. Because the first thing they steal is the name, and the first thing we're going to do is put it back. And outside on the red Colorado earth where an honest man had once driven a stake into the ground and paid for it with his life. The mine he'd dreamed of ran on in the winter. Light, honest ground, honest wage, honest books. And the truth that corrupt men had tried to bury under fever stories and forged records and unmarked graves stood upright at last in the middle of the territory, permanent and plain, because one woman had been brave enough to make a whole world remember it, and braver still to build something lasting on the ground where they'd tried to erase her. They could steal the paper. They could threaten the witnesses. They could silence a town for a while, but they could not erase the truth. Not anymore. Not ever again. Not while Clara Whitmore kept the books.